Can you believe as of March 2024, Dark Souls 2 is 10 years old? Love it or hate it, DS2, as unique as it is still very worth discussing. And to do just that, I've invited my friend Trilorim back onto the channel to talk all things Drangleic, from beginning to end, lore, NPCs, bosses, gameplay, level design, and of course, this game's foggy reputation in history. In a recent IGN interview, From Software president and Dark Souls creator Hidetaka Miyazaki said, "In regards to Dark Souls 2, I actually personally think this was a really great project for us, and I think without it, we wouldn't have had a lot of the connections and a lot of the ideas that went forward and carried the rest of the series." We were able to have that different impetus and have those different ideas and make those different connections that we otherwise might not have had. There's really no way of telling how or if the series would have continued the way it did without Dark Souls 2. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoy this long-form discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts about DS2 down in the comments. I'm reluctant to start our Dark Souls 2 discussion on the topic of polarization, but number one, it gets it out of the way. And number two, I think it'll probably give us some good context and like building blocks to work on with the rest of our discussion. So not surprising to anybody who knows From Soft's games that DS2 is quite possibly the most polarizing. I would say the most polarizing game to come out of the Hidetaka Miyazaki era of From Software. Now, Miyazaki only supervised and consulted on the game because he was working on Bloodborne during 2013 and 2014. So director duties were first passed off to Tomohiro Shibuya, who after some difficulties, which I don't think we'll ever know the full story there, Shibuya was dismissed and replaced with Yui Tanimura, who took the game to the finish line, later goes on to co-direct Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, and is likely Miyazaki's most trusted collaborator based on what we know as of present day. But for those reasons, DS2 was delayed. Eventually came out in early 2014, a bit longer after DS1, I think, than they intended. Tanimura himself called the development process troubled in his Design Works interview and said that development essentially had to start over from scratch midway through when he took over. So that meant that some elements of the existing game had to be shuffled around, new meaning had to be assigned to some of the existing characters, levels, assets. For example, we know there was a child version of the Emerald Herald in the original game. And like as we were talking about before we started recording, cut or rushed content is pretty much a theme with every Soulsborne game, like from Lost Izalith to the Chalice Dungeon. So yeah, nothing really new there. But DS2 uses a pretty different version of From's engine than Demon Souls or Dark Souls 1 or really any of the games after it. So like geometrically, texturally, everything just kind of looks a little different. Movement and combat also feels noticeably different from the previous two Souls games. Demon Souls is a bit snappier and faster paced. Dark Souls slows things down a bit in terms of movement, speed, and animations. I think maybe at the time the thought was that that slower pace would make DS1 as a multi-plat like a little more accessible to people than Demon Souls. And then, yeah, DS2 is just different. Leland, you once described it to me as like a pseudo turn-based game, and I actually think that's a really brilliant way to put it. And I think anybody who's played a lot of DS2 knows exactly what you meant by that. Like there's this greater emphasis on poise and stun locking and prolonged animations. And while attack animations can be quite slow compared to, let's say, like Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3, running speed is actually fairly fast, yet turning is slow. So like every move from the swing of a sword to an evasive roll to strafing is a really big commitment. And you can get kind of locked into these animation sequences that only, even if they only last a second or two, those can feel like an eternity if you miscalculate them in a boss battle. And there's just like, for that reason, a greater emphasis on, I think, anticipating the enemy AI's next move, kind of letting them take their turn, so to speak, then registering your next move. So I think this unique game feel is probably why some players find DS2 frustrating. Like you end up watching yourself kind of helplessly take damage or die on screen. And I actually texted you about this earlier today. I kind of feel like the general combat gameplay, it requires maybe even more so than skill, just patience. Like even Sekiro, it's a crazy fast-paced game, but you get to instantly resurrect the first time you die. And then even if you die twice, you can quickly sprint right back to where you were. And when you start thinking about DS2 in comparison, it's far less forgiving in that sense. There's also new mechanics like adaptability that affect your iframes and evasiveness in battle that was automatic in the previous games, and in my opinion, is not explained very well to players in DS2. And I think if it had been tutorialized a little better, a lot of frustration probably could have been avoided. And then maybe the biggest part of this whole DS2 puzzle is instead of being a direct follow-up to DS1, DS2 takes place in Drangleic, a different kingdom in a different time, but still within the same universe of Gwen and Manus and the First Flame. And unlike DS1 and Demon Souls, its storytelling and world building, I find them very interesting, but they're experienced by the player at a pretty different cadence, like the sequence of events, character motivations, like the very basic history of this new kingdom you're in can feel way more obtuse and vague and open to interpretation than almost any other Soulsborne game, in my opinion. Definitely more so than the two games that came before it. And there's, when you start a new game file, there's no Dragon Ball style montage, neatly tying the two games together and telling you, well, last time in Dark Souls, and then there's a montage of Gwen or something. There's really none of that because instead of
Mhm.
spelling out like the timelines and the fates of the major players from DS1, the game doesn't really do much of that because the devs have decided those details aren't terribly important. Instead, they're much more interested in turning the spotlight back on you and asking you a ton of big philosophical questions with no clear right or wrong answers. Questions that honestly do a pretty nice job, I would say, of like teeing up DS3, Lothric refusing to link the flame, the development of the deep and Aldrich, stuff like that. But yeah, prior to DS3, some of Aldia's questions, let's say, might feel pretty unexpected and strange. And then obviously, Aldia wasn't even in the original game. So when it released in 2014, I guess going back to that like vanilla DS2, I was there on day one. I had my pre-ordered Xbox 360 steel case. I think it was called the Black Armor Edition. And yeah, me and my friends, we were part of this like far smaller community, smaller but growing community. And yeah, like when the game came out, it was received really positively. I think to this day, I checked, it's still like a 92 on Metacritic. It received three fairly substantial DLC episodes, which most players, I would say, feel add maybe the best boss battles and level design in the game. And they do a lot more to flesh out the narrative and this overarching idea of like what makes a king, what makes a lord, what does it take, where have others faltered? And then, so that's 2014. And then the following year in 2015, all that DLC content, in addition to a slightly remixed and visually enhanced version of the base game called Scholar of the First Sin releases. So that just kind of makes DS2 even more obtuse. And, some players prefer vanilla, some players prefer Scholar. Again, it's just another polarizing aspect of the game. But Scholar most notably adds a lot of Aldia content to the game. Aldia in the world of Drangleic is the king's brother and sort of devoted himself to a fault to exploring an alternative to the binary of fire and dark. So for this reason alone, I believe Scholar feels like the more complete and intended experience. And I think for the purposes of this discussion, we'll probably more be referencing Scholar, right?
Yeah, that's the game that I actually have gained all my experience of Dark Souls 2 from.
Right.
As I first got started with FromSoft games with Sekiro when that first released, and then I kind of worked my way back gradually. So I just kind of naturally landed on Scholar.
Yeah, and honestly, I've played Scholar so much over the years. Some of my memories of the vanilla game are kind of vague. So, like I said, I feel like Scholar is sort of the more complete. It feels like kind of the more intended experience. But then I also feel like some of that remixed
Mhm.
gameplay content, some of the phantoms and things like that, it doesn't really add anything to the experience other than, yeah, frustration because there's these needless,
Mhm.
invasions, mobs, and other ganky annoyances like that. So, yeah, to put a bow on it, my belief is that while DS2 is no doubt a very different kind of game than DS1 or DS3 that some players are just understandably not going to care for. I have always been
Mhm.
suspicious of that blanket DS2 sucks narrative. I think it's more accurate in my
Mhm.
mind, like more productive to say DS2 is different. Again, being there at launch, the media reception was positive. I know my friends and I were mesmerized by it, surely more so than like, Assassin's Creed Unity or Witcher 3 or I don't know, name your 2014, 2015 third person ARPG. But I totally respect anyone's right to go, hey, this game is not for me. I don't care for the ways in which it's different. I don't like it. I'd rather just play Bloodborne or Elden Ring or whatever, and that's fine. I just believe this very absolute kind of no room for negotiation, DS2 sucks narrative. That's, in my opinion, a more recent development and largely the result of,
Mm.
I guess, what I'd call Reddit groupthink. I do believe you have a large number of people who either haven't played the game or haven't given a fair chance, or they just, I don't know, parrot back things they've heard from Asmongold or any other big content creator who's screamed at the top of their lungs on a Twitch stream about how the game is pure trash and anyone who likes it is a moron. I think DS2 is a great game, genuinely. And I think, especially given its rocky development, and if anything, Yui Tanimura probably shouldn't be criticized, but actually praised for saving the game and getting it to the finish line. Now, I don't love DS2 as much as I love like DS3 or Demon Souls, but I do love it. It's a big part of my gaming history. It's not a game I'll apologize for, and yeah, it's a game I still run through like at least once a year these days because I still find it to be like pretty fascinating, and I think it still outshines most of what other studios are doing like 10 years later. And yeah, I'm coming off a fresh playthrough. I'm really excited to talk through it with you, but that's my rant to get us going here. Before we get into the actual game, stories, level, stuff like that, any big picture thoughts yourself, Leland, on this game, its reputation, its history, your time with it?
Yeah, I think, you hit the nail on the head by saying it's a different from soft game. And naturally, that's due to kind of its, like you were describing, the wonky production cycle that went down with Shibuya kind of messing things up, and then Tanimura having to come in and put the pieces of this puzzle back together that might not have fit together as they intended when the project was first announced. But I think different versus just outright bad is a good way of kind of changing that narrative around Dark Souls 2, because yeah, it's not, for me, it's not at the top of my list for favorite FromSoft games, but there is 100% merit in playing it and experiencing the differences that are found and can be found in Dark Souls 2 playthroughs. But yeah, I've experienced this game enough to know that there are things I don't like and things that I do like about this game. And the people who are so adamantly in the camp of this game is bad are just blinding themselves to some of the best RPG like elements that I've seen in a video game, right? Like from character creation to setting to settings plural, just all the different areas found within Dark Souls 2, playing to the strengths of world building, the boss fights, just the overall aesthetics of this game speak volumes for the project as a whole. And I think people don't look at the big picture. They like to, as you said, get in a lane for this narrative and just kind of ignore some of the assets that really kind of you still see today in the FromSoft production cycle. Like there are 100% elements found in Dark Souls 2 that are now still found in Elden Ring today. And I think we need to praise Tanimura for being able to come in and pick up the pieces, and then also persevere and continue bringing some of the good ideology found in Dark Souls 2 within current FromSoft projects today.
I actually do want to talk about the intro cinematic before we get into things betwixt, because there is a callback to the intro cinematic in the tutorial level. And I also think because DS2 can be a bit obtuse, it's helpful to talk through and spell out like some of the world and story stuff, because I think a better understanding of like what's actually going on here can make the gameplay experience a lot more enjoyable. And this intro thematic is unique because unlike the one in Demon Souls, DS1 and DS3, it's less about the world and the characters, and it's more about you, the player, and your past and your motivations. So essentially, you're this wandering warrior. You're braving the elements in a stormy forest, and you've left your home because of this dream, this vision you had of how you could cure this undead curse you have that's making you, I guess, amnesiac. Like you barely remember who you are, the faces of your family. So here you are staggering through muddy puddles, and you seek shelter in an old cabin, and you meet this lapsed, reclusive firekeeper. And she seems to know who you are and what you're doing. And she speaks of this place you saw in your mind, this fading kingdom of Drangleic, and she speaks of the dark sign, which is eroding your humanity. It's this metaphysical brand created by Gwyn's first sin, by his decision to relink the first flame prior to the events of DS1. And she tells you you'll forget everything. You'll become a mindless monster who feeds on souls. You'll go hollow because all hollows were once undead, but not all undeads are hollows, if that makes sense. But she says you've been drawn to Drangleic's gate like a moth to flame. It's your destiny. And so you continue on kind of haunted by her words. You find this gate, I guess you've been looking for on the far side of a lake. It opens before you, revealing a portal. And with nothing to lose, you fall into it. And then you wake up in this purgatory of sorts called Things Betwixt. It's the tutorial level of the game. I think it's very reminiscent of Ash Lake from DS1, which I always thought probably represented like the oldest, deepest part of Lordran, like a callback to when the world was gray and foggy and full of
Mm-hmm.
giant trees. So yeah, Things Betwixt
Totally.
looks a lot like that. And up ahead, there's a giant fissure, kind of reminiscent of the fissure you encounter at the beginning of Demon Souls that leads you to the kingdom of Boletaria. But before the fissure, there's this hut built into the bottom of one of these giant trees, and in it are three more firekeepers and their attendant. And they're like super saucy. They basically start roasting you as soon as you walk in, and they're telling you you're gonna go hollow.
Right
And
out the
they,
gate.
yes, right out of the gate, and they reveal that they know you spoke to the other firekeeper on the way here, as if she's been guiding undeads to them. But they prompt you to remember your name and what you look like, which is where the character creator comes in, and then sends you
Mhm.
to tell you to trot along to the kingdom and attempt to break your curse again. This undead curse caused by the so-called first sin, and then there's a little optional, tutorial level before you leave Things Betwixt. It actually kind of reminds me of how they handled the optional tutorial cave in Elden Ring. But yeah, any
Mm.
thoughts on this intro as a whole before we get on to Majula?
Perhaps you've seen it. Maybe in a dream, a murky, forgotten land.
Do you want to know what she's never seen? A dentist.
Or you know what else she hasn't seen? Probably anything because I think she's blind.
Good call.
But yeah, her yeah, she's got quite the look about her. But yeah, her monologue is just it's so good. And her talking about, standing before Drangleic's decrepit gates without really knowing why, and yeah, being kind of drawn on and kind of inspired by, the fate of the cursed. To be hollow is to seek Drangleic. Yeah, I agree that it's such a unique intro scene because every other FromSoft intro scene just feels very, what's the word? Like, I don't know, too, I guess, too lore centered, like you were saying, to like, here are the big bosses. I'm thinking Dark Souls 3, you see Yorm, whereas here, yeah, it's just you. It's just you in the cutscene. So definitely a unique intro. And then, yeah, Things Betwixt is you're tossed right into it. It's a super scary, chaotic, kind of dark plane that you have to like traverse. You enter this hut, and then you enter this kind of like really dark and kind of dank ravine with all these little tutorial areas. It really sets the tone right out the gate that like, yeah, this is a Souls game. I've always really loved the intro, and then yeah, we'll talk about Majula, but the transition from Things Betwixt to Majula just sets Majula apart and just denotes the player immediately like, oh, this is home. Like this is my haven. So that kind of the contrast between the deep, dark, and creepy Things Betwixt and then opening up into like this heavenly Majula is just one of the most memorable parts of this game to me for sure.
Yeah, that's a great call. I do think there's a subtext there where, like you said, you start in the dark and then you enter the light. Kind of commentary on the game world as a whole. Are you of the belief too, Leland, that like there's not physically, literally a cave in the back of Majula that Things Betwixt is in, that it's almost like
Mm-hmm.
you're almost in like another dimension, sort of. It feels like a
Mm-hmm.
limbo. I think they even refer to it as limbo. I
Mm-hmm.
believe it's Millibeth, the attendant. She might actually refer to Things Betwixt as a limbo.
I guess that would make sense. That's kind of like the pit that that big whirlpool planar gate that you fall into in the cutscene. Maybe that's just your journey through that portal is the Things Betwixt before you hit Majula.
Right. Well, and then in the design works book, there's actually concept art for that lake and that gate that's in the cinematic. So I always wondered if in an earlier version of the game, that was like a level. We actually controlling our player went to that lake or something. But you're right, we kind of go through this fissure, we go through this passageway, and as you said, boom, the light is shining, and we're in this kind of makeshift seaside settlement called Majula,
Mhm.
where undeads and misfit travelers gather. Salden, the Crestfallen in this game, after
Mhm.
Hawkwood, he's like probably my favorite Crestfallen. He's got some really good lines, and I have
Mhm.
his text right here. He describes Majula pretty aptly. He says it is a kind of settlement, a place where life is almost normal. And in Drangleic these
Mhm.
days, there's very few places like that. And then he's got this line in Drangleic, the flow of time is convoluted. Things shift and waver, twist and turn. Some people write this off as a lazy excuse for why things in this game or even other Souls games maybe aren't perfectly resolved with a bow on top. But I actually really like the Pandora's box this line opens up because, this
Mhm.
isn't our reality. This is a fictitious game world. It's a fantasy world. And I do think in select cases, this line kind of explains some, I don't know, odd occurrences. But yeah, this is a top hub area for me, like visually, aesthetically.
Mhm.
It's just gorgeous. The music, the color palette, the branching paths, the pit, the mansion, some really memorable NPCs. Talk to me about this place.
Yeah, I think it's for me it's my sec favorite. I have to give it to Firelink Shrine in Dark Souls 3. That is home to me in a FromSoft game. But this is easily number 2. Thinking on all the other hub areas, they do a good job of kind of giving you this sense of safety, but none give you such a sense of home as Majula does, and I think it's because of the eclectic gathering of all the different NPCs that are there and that show up there as you progress throughout your journey. And then yeah, just the fact that it's this super warm and the sun is shining, you've got this beautiful view of like the ocean. It's just a very welcoming tiny little part of the map that you will just always see as home throughout your journey.
Shalquar is one of my favorite Soulsborne NPCs ever. Like so much insightful
Hmm.
dialogue from her. She's this long-haired cat in one of the houses. Lots of room to
Hmm.
interpret maybe who she was and where she's been prior to the events of the game. The armorer, who's this down on his luck merchant with no confidence at the beginning of the game, who becomes increasingly pompous the more money you spend
Yeah,
with him. Yeah.
Small. My notes literally just say pompous bitch, but he gives you cool armor at least. So
Yeah.
pompous is definitely the word there.
Yeah, so many, just a lot of memorable characters, some who come and go during the course of the game. And then, of course, the Emerald Herald. Like, is
Mm,
she, because we meet, I believe up until this point, we have already met four firekeepers, kind of, they seem like lapsed firekeepers, kind of reclusive. It's not exactly clear why they're not just, tending to bonfires somewhere. They obviously seem very old, but age is kind of like a relative thing in this world. So the Emerald Herald, like, is she a firekeeper? I don't know because
hmm.
you actually manipulate the fire in the game, not her. Like she levels you
Right.
up and gives you an Estus flask, but we do know she's like half dragon, that she's some kind of experiment. She was created probably by Aldia and or Vendrick to like break the curse, and then that didn't happen. So
Mm,
now she's here to guide you. So yeah, she's a very mysterious character, and there's this notion that she has this purpose given to her by her creator, very much like Melina in Elden Ring.
hmm.
So yeah, she's definitely not your average firekeeper.
Yeah, and then we've also got blacksmith Leningrast, who just
What a
old
jerk.
faithful, and I I love that he's just like right out the get go, he's locked out of his blacksmith. So it's like you're locked out of your shop. How can I trust you with my weapons right out the gate? You know?
Well, and he appears like he's pretty far along in the hollowing process too. He does not look well.
Mm-mm. Yeah, no, definitely does not look well.
But
Um,
yeah, so it's interesting. So when you get to Majula and you find the Emerald Herald, dramatically on the cliffside looking out at the ocean, she tells you you're too weak. to become Drangleic's next monarch, which is, this is all news to you. You have no idea what's going on. And that you should seek the powerful souls of the old ones, or the ineffables, as some
Mhm.
flavor text calls them, which this is one of those places where DS2 has like a very obtuse interpretation of DS1. Like basically, DS2 says the souls of Gwen, the Witch of Izalith, Nito, and Seath never really died or were destroyed. That it's almost like every generation or so, those souls find new hosts. So
Mhm.
Gwen's soul is currently possessed by the old Iron King. The Witch's is with the Lost Sinner, Nito's is with the Rotten, and then Seath's is in Brightstone Cove, guarded by Freya the Spider. So in
Mhm.
terms of progression, because you can go to a few different places right off the bat, I'm going to mostly follow the order laid out in the game's fast travel menu as much as I can, which, even that, right? Your ability to fast travel immediately. Um,
Mhm.
you can dismiss that as a gameplay convenience. And I know Tanimura has even spoken about that because it's a quality of life thing. But there does appear to be a broken Lord Vessel in the basement of the Majula mansion. And of course, like the Lord Vessel
Yeah.
is an item given to the, chosen undead in DS1, which allows them to warp between bonfires. So I don't know. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally forgot about the mansion, and it's really interesting that throughout your journey there are certain, I forget how it works too, because it's kind of like weirdly complex, but there are certain bonfires that like if it'll add a fire at the in the basement of the mansion. There's this big map of Drangleic, and it hit these different bonfires, it actually lights up on the big map in the basement. And there's some like the cartographer, and I think isn't it like after certain checkpoints you like unlock new items, or like new items appear in the basement too. I don't know the
I
specifics of that,
I
but
want to
yeah,
say that back in the day, the devs would update that chest because there's a unique chest in that sort of dug up part of the basement where the skeleton is.
yeah,
That's a unique chest that doesn't appear anywhere else in the game. And I want to say that at one point that chest was used for maybe like online play items. My memory's foggy on that,
mhm.
but I think do you maybe get like what is it, a soul vessel from it?
The skeletons.
There's like a scratching sound you can always hear down there, but you never get to the bottom of it, of like what it is. But it's very, very creepy. And like you said, the flames
Mhm.
populate on that like stone map that the Kale the cartographer is just mesmerized by, which he also is like
Mhm.
amnesiac. If you talk to him, he doesn't seem to even remember like who he is or what he's doing. He almost remembers like, oh yeah, maps. I like maps. And like maybe he's sort of
Mhm.
experiencing what you're experiencing to a degree. But yeah, it's
Mhm.
the mansion is very eerie.
Yeah, a lot of mystery behind it, and it's kind of like right in the center of town too. But yeah, you need to get the key from the old cartographer, which that's kind of a funny first interaction you have with him. Cardinal Tower. I'm trying to remember.
It is. It's
I
in
just
that
remember there being a
cave.
big boulder. Yeah, yeah, the
Yeah, there's
cave and the
like
big
the
boulder
Indiana
comes through.
Jones like environmental hazard, and
Yeah,
if you get by that, you just find him on all fours, and he's like, "Oh, hello.
it's
I
like, oh, you
think
didn't
I
see that
like maps,
giant
but I
boulder?
can't really remember. Who are you?" You know?
Giant boulder almost just killed me, but yeah, let's talk about maps.
But yeah, let's roll into first level, which is Forest of the Fallen Giants, which then right leads to Cardinal Tower, which is basically
Mhm.
this like old fortress by the sea,
Mhm.
culminating with boss battles with the last giant and the pursuer. I really like this level. I do think it's one of the better designed
Mhm.
levels in the base game. There's lots of shortcuts and secrets and different pathways. The pursuer's design is just badass. It's iconic. He's this red-eyed killer, maybe not even he, maybe it, but it's this red-eyed killer swooping in on a raven that all kind of feels like an Armored Core reference to me. But it seems like the Pursuer is like an undead hunter, kind of like the talk of like tarnished
Mhm.
hunters in Elden Ring, but can't really say like did he serve Vendrick? I
Mhm.
don't know. In my head canon, he's like this twisted rogue vigilante, basically like a morally corrupt Batman who just swoops in and kills undead. But yeah, so he's on the roof, and then Last Giant,
Mhm.
who's also significant, is down in the basement. But I don't know any general
Yeah.
thoughts about these bosses or this level.
Yeah, as just like a quick aside about Pursuer, because he will follow you throughout the game. Like he'll just pop up in other levels too, which is really interesting. And that actually happened to me today after I beat Smelter Demon. I went back to Majula. I came back, but I went to the very first Iron Keep bonfire. And as I was going through it, I got invaded by Forlorn. And then immediately, as I was running through the boss, that the Smelter Demon boss room, the Pursuer shows up, and I'm like,
Yep.
"What's going on here? I just cleared this level. I just beat the Smelter Demon. Why am I getting invaded by Forlorn?" And the Pursuer shows up right now.
Which
It's
that's
just
probably just like bad RNG for you because the Forlorn
yeah.
invasions are pretty random. So you got hit with that
Mhm.
and the Pursuer.
The double, yeah. They doubled down. It was just such like a surreal moment.
Right. And I think that's the last time you see him. Like that's the strongest form of the Pursuer.
Yeah.
Like because in vanilla, I don't believe he pursued you throughout additional levels,
Hmm.
but in Scholar, you fight him multiple times in Lost Bastille, and then
Yeah, Lost Bastille.
he also appears in things Betwixt, which is really weird. He appears on that island with the gender changing coffin and the two ogres.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yep, which is really
That
strange given like what we talked about, things Betwixt kind of being like a limbo. And then right, the last time is in that Smelter Demon arena. And I think he drops maybe like Ring of Blades or something, maybe like something like that, a Ring of Steel Protection or something, but like a pretty useful ring.
Yeah, something like that.
Pretty cool. I definitely
That
got flashed as the Pursuer in Elden Ring when Morgott shows up in that field in the Altus Plateau,
oh
and it's like,
yeah.
whoa, this guy's like coming after me. He's still around, and it very much reminded
Hmm.
me of these encounters with the Pursuer.
100%. And that the first interaction with him flying down out of the air, out of nowhere, this giant knight, easily the most imposing enemy you've seen
Yeah.
so far in the game, just appears out of nowhere, comes crashing down out of the sky. Definitely one of the most memorable encounters in Dark Souls 2 in the early game by far.
Well, and remember, you can fight him even before that on that raised platform that's actually above the cave where you meet Kale the Cartographer.
That's the moment I was referring to, is that
Okay.
initial where you're on the, yeah, it's the, you're crossing the like top of the wall to kind of first enter
Yeah.
Cardinal Tower, where yeah, you climb up and you see a bunch of, oh, there's a bunch of items up here. I'll just run around and pick up all these items. I'm totally safe. Haha, it's fine. And then boom, pursuer fight.
Yeah. Which I remember like, having played Dark Souls 1, was like, I'm not falling for this. This is a big empty area
Yeah.
full of treasure. This is too good to be true. But yeah, then what do you have to say about Last Giant down in the basement?
He rips off his arm, which is cool, which is very, Godric is my boy. So a bit of a callback to, I guess, Lost Giant is kind of the OG, or Last Giant is the OG Godric in that regard, ripping
And
off your own
Magdala
arm.
too. And Magdala
Um,
uses its arms against you.
oh yeah, true. So lots of tearing your own limbs for a second phase in FromSoft games. It's an interesting little through line. But yeah, I don't know. I like Last Giant. It's an easy fight. You just kind of like hang up by its feet and just moving right. I think you win that fight. But yeah, definitely cool kind of way to show the player that, oh yeah, there are some pretty big beasties that you'll be fighting throughout your playthrough.
When I feel like there's probably less to say about the Last Giant, and probably this is probably a good time to like introduce Vendrick because
Mm,
Vendrick is like so intertwined with the giants. So
right.
Vendrick is the last monarch of Drangleic, and he's sort of this specter over the most of the game. And his brother Aldia helped him sort of oversee the kingdom, but we're told Vendrick never claimed the true throne. Like, despite ruling over the kingdom, he never succeeded Gwyn. He never actually linked the fire or intentionally allowed it to fade. It's like he did everything up until that point, and then there was, analysis paralysis or something. But anyway, eventually, this mysterious and beautiful woman named Nashandra shows up in Drangleic and warns Vendrick of a threat across the seas. And apparently, Vendrick's just a pushover because that's all it took. She becomes the queen, and he takes an army across the sea to this land of giants and wages war. And Vendrick seizes some kind of prized power from the giants, but we never really find out what that was. But right, kills a bunch of them, brings some back to Drangleic as prisoners, and he and Aldia also experimented on them. Like there's a pile of mutilated giants in Aldia's keep. And then
Mm,
this explains the last giant you find in fight at the bottom of Cardinal Tower. And somehow these experiments like helped Vendrick and Aldia better understand the nature of the soul, it seems. And with that knowledge, they created the golems, which kind of look like the giants. and they're
Mm.
otherwise inanimate, like they're made of stone but can ultimately come alive if powered by souls. Like we see this mechanic in Drangleic Castle later in the game where if you kill an enemy near a golem, the enemy's soul goes into the golem, activates it, and that opens doors and stuff. So we're told these golems built Drangleic Castle for Vendrick and Nashandra. But later, the King of the Giants rounds up his army and they stage like a counter invasion of Drangleic as revenge. And this basically destroys the kingdom. It reduces most everything to a rubble. And you can actually relive those moments or moments in that war through the giant memories activated by the giant trees scattered around Cardinal Tower. Here's a bit of fun flavor text too from the giant tree seeds item. When the giants fell, they grew into great trees. Death is not the end, for anything that has ever once lived remains a part of a great cycle of regeneration. But what of those outside the cycle? So
Mm.
these giants also, I feel like worth noting, the giants across the sea from Drangleic, they seem to almost be like a different creed or race of giants than we see in like DS1 and DS3. Giants like Yorm and Hawkeye Go, like they're pretty different looking.
Hmm.
But yeah, like we're told this war like really screws up Drangleic, and then Drangleic is affected by this undead curse too at this point, which is this like plight of the first flame. And Vendrick, who apparently was just a sucker up until this point, starts to go, what's up with this queen of mine? And he and Aldia are like desperately trying to find a path beyond fire and dark. Like they're trying to break out of this binary that Gwyn is largely responsible for. And in doing
Mm.
so, Vendrick realizes that Nashandra is actually a fragment of Manus, father of the Abyss from DS1. Because when the Chosen Undead kills Manus at the end of DS1's Artorias of the Abyss DLC, Manus' soul splits into four fragments, each becoming the queens of the Lost Crown DLCs in DS2 along with Nashandra. And they like each represented a different aspect of Manus. And Nashandra represents his want, his longing for power. So she longs for the first flame, and she's been playing Vendrick this whole time. Like he is her key to the flame. So as you do on the cusp of any breakup, Vendrick puts together contingency plans. He wants to make sure, crazy Nashandra cannot claim the throne and thereby the flame. So number one, he puts Throne Watcher and Defender by the throne. Number two, he uses his golems, these like giant proxies, to keep Nashandra like physically away from the throne. The throne is like on this other side of this chasm, and because I guess Nashandra isn't Super Mario, she'd need to make use of these golems to like create a bridge and cross, but she can't without the power of the giant's kinship. You see like how, convoluted this gets. And then number three, Vendrick, he goes to the furthest extreme and he locks himself away in the undead crypt with his loyal knight
Mm.
Velstad. So she literally cannot get to him, which is essentially self-sacrifice because he's,
Mm.
he's undead, he's burdened by the curse too, and eventually goes hollow. Meaning his like identity and personality and memories are all, stripped away, kind of leaving him to be this zombie. And it kind of seems like Vendrick maybe sealed Aldia away too, beforehand, because Aldia's keep has one of those giant king's gates before it that you cannot open without Vendrick's
Mm.
ring. Like maybe Aldia was even more of a loose cannon, like Vendrick was just like, okay, you've gone too far. Like maybe
Mm.
there was no limit to what Aldia would do. To discover like this third way. And, by the time of DS2, Scholar, when we actually meet Aldia, he's like not even human anymore. He almost seems like he's
Right.
become, fused with the flame or something because he only appears at bonfires. But yeah, I don't know. Does this kind of get any thoughts turning for you on just like this strange cast of characters we're dealing with in this world?
Yeah, I guess, I'm not the biggest lore buff, but I didn't realize just how interconnected Dark Souls 2 was to Dark Souls 1. Yeah, just how interconnected the worlds are and how basically the entire premise and plotline of Dark Souls 2 as, kind of hard to piece together as it is for the uninitiated player. I think the narrative plotline of Dark Souls 2 is pretty, you're grasping at strings a little bit. You're pretty much just following the Herald's word, Emerald Herald's word throughout your journey. But no, kind of knowing the background, it's really interesting to kind of reconsider, particularly Vendrick being kind of a tragic character. Obviously, he brought his demise upon himself by trusting Nashandra, but the lengths he went to try to kind of preserve the kingdom in the end, in that self-sacrifice. You see him later in the game at Drangleic Castle, in the crypts or whatever, and he looks just like completely yeah, hollow. He's just dragging his sword, walking in circles. It's one of the more haunting moments of the game. So kind of having a bit more context for that is really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Vendrick is the Gwyn character of DS2, but he's quite a bit more interesting, I think, because you
Hmm.
just learn a lot more about him, and he has like different dimensions to him. And yeah, and then like with Aldia, I kind of wonder if like through all of his experiments, he intentionally or unintentionally cast away his human flesh, almost like Ronnie does in
Hmm.
Elden Ring. Yeah, so the deal though is Vendrick seals himself away to Hollow. Aldia is MIA, and Nashandra cannot access the throne until she meets us. Another fun fact is if Shalakar can be believed, the ancient dragon isn't actually a real dragon at all. It's some kind of creation or illusion. I know before
Hmm.
Scholar, a lot of us suspected it was Aldia because we know Aldia tried to create a dragon. So perhaps, oh, he succeeded, he's the dragon. But
Right.
interestingly, the dragon gives us the Ashen Mist Heart, which allows us to experience other people's memories from the past. And in doing this, we can relive battles with the giants. We can even visit Vendrick before he went hollow and
Hmm.
talk to him. So yeah, it's a really deep story and it's a really complex world. In the game, I don't want to say the game doesn't do the best job of like serving this information up to you because I guess
Hmm.
they didn't want to serve it up to you nicely and neatly with a bow on top, but yeah, it is pretty interesting the more you dig into it. And something I like about DS2 is there's always somewhere to go and explore. You rarely, if ever, are trapped into like
Hmm.
one linear progression. So if you curl up in the Raven's Nest atop Cardinal Tower, the Raven will fly you out to Lost Bastille. Alternatively,
Hmm.
you can reach Lost Bastille another way, which is the route I would propose we take in our discussion here. That means returning to Majula and from Majula heading to Hyde's Tower.
Sounds great. Yeah, that's my preferred method as well. So let's do it.
So, this location, I would say, is pretty famous in the community for its visual beauty. Even 10 years later,
Oh
it
yeah.
still looks awesome. And
Hmm.
from must dig it too, because these aesthetics that turn, they came back big time in Elden Ring. And my read is that Hyde was this old part of Drangleic, like probably built as like an homage to Anne Orlando or something, with the tower itself representing the first flame. I think that probably explains old Dragonslayer too. Because I remember that was a point of confusion when the game came out. Like I initially was like, whoa, I guess this is Ornstein, but I actually believe this is someone just cosplaying like the legend of Ornstein. But
Yep.
it seems like the whole place just became flooded and like most of the structures sank into the sea. And I remember when we did that DS2 boss tier stream on your Twitch channel, we talked about this a little bit, but my only wish for this area is that it was longer, and more complex because it feels like when it's
Yep.
just getting good, it's over. But yeah, what do you got for me on Hyde's Tower of Flame?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much hit the nail on the head with it being one of the most aesthetically pleasing parts of any Souls game. And again, it kind of goes back to that moment where, going from things betwixt into Majula, it's like going through all those like, kind of stone wall like tunnels from Majula to Hyde's Tower. It's just like pretty basic kind of like waterway tunnel passage and then just opens up into like all these super high fantasy kind of castle ruins just yeah submerged in what appears to be just this massive like ocean. It's another one of those just like wow visual moments. And yeah, I just love all of the like old knights that are just kind of hanging around the level that aren't aggro to you when you first arrive. And the big kind of dragon, not like actual dragon riders, but like the dragon rider esque enemies, the big hulking knights that are like lumbering around. Yeah, I don't know. Like you said, it's too small of an area. Like I wish, in my mind, it was built out to the extent that Anne Orlando might have, that to that kind of like expansiveness. Because visually you feel the expansiveness of the area, but it's pretty linear kind of run through, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, and I think this area though probably what it does is it makes you realize like how much diversity there is in the different biomes in DS2. I'd say like
Mhm.
probably before Elden Ring DS2 had the most biome diversity. Like you just go to so many different kinds of places and
Yep.
yeah, there's the Blue Sentinels Covenant is based here and then there's Licia of Lindell, who I always think of like
Hmm.
female Patches a little bit. Like she's this pretty morally questionable miracle merchant
Mm.
who, if you talk to her, it's kind of like, what do you got going on here? Like it almost feels like maybe From's way of,
Hmm.
commenting on how often these religious figures are, not what they seem or corrupt themselves or something.
Hmm.
So she's pretty interesting. But I almost forgot to mention the Dragonrider, because to get to the next area, you have to defeat the Dragonrider boss,
Hmm.
which all we really know is they were some of Vendrick's most elite knights who were told literally like rode dragons at some point. So I don't know if like this one maybe just wandered to hide after the giant war and Vendrick would follow,
He
but
fell off his dragon.
oh
He's just here
yeah.
now.
That is funny. Well, I mean, in Scholar, they added the Wyvern or whatever on the other side of the level. So I don't know if,
Yep.
we're supposed to like surmise something there. But yeah, anyway, you defeat him, you can actually descend into No Man's Wharf, which is one of my favorite locations in the games. I feel like, a lot of
Mhm.
DS2, it is pretty heavy-handed with mobs, but there is like a nice sort of horseshoe-shaped climb and descent in terms of the level design, and there's lots of individual buildings to explore. Surprisingly, there's quite a few important NPCs here too. And, this whole kind of like
Mhm.
Pirates Cove vibe is just so cool to me. Like you can literally ring a ship into the wharf and then ride it out to the Bastille. So yeah, I don't know.
Mhm.
Thoughts on No Man's Wharf?
Oh, it's easily top five areas in Dark Souls 2. I love every time I come to the No Man's Wharf, I know I'm going to deal with some of the gankiness that's hyper present in Dark Souls 2. But yeah, how can you not love this weird little like Viking pirate cove where you first meet Lucatiel, one of the best swordsmen
Hmm.
in the land. Yeah, then you end up fighting Flexile Sentry on this giant pirate ship. It's just like, yeah. And then, yeah, I also noted the verticality of this level is really, really interesting to explore. There are all these different buildings kind of spread out. And then, yeah, the one weakness to this level, I think, is probably just the maybe overabundance of, enemies in certain spots. But it's not like unmanageable. After a couple runs, you kind of get the lay of the land. But yeah, I think it's one of the best designed levels in Dark Souls 2 for sure.
Totally. And I'm trying to think of the is it Bradley of the Old Guard? There's that shade on like the wharf itself that you can summon, which he can kind of help you a little bit, fight your way through and
Hmm.
deal with the mobs. And like you said, we meet Lucatiel here. You can also summon her for the Flexile Sentry boss battle. I guess the Flexile Sentry is sort of like this monster, probably created by Vendrick and Aldia, but its job is to
Hmm.
ferry undead from the wharf out to Lost Bastille, which is a prison, kind of like Undead Asylum in DS1. Like they were just running out of room and they had all these undead. So it's like, yeah, ship them off to the Bastille. I actually
Hmm.
prefer entering the Bastille this way because not only is the wharf cool, but you can ride the ship right into those exile holding cells just like a prisoner would, versus having
Hmm.
to Raven carry you from Cardinal Tower to the Tower apart. Lucatiel is interesting because her journey like very much mirrors ours. Like she goes to the places we go. She's struggling like we are. She's slowly turning hollow. And sort of unlike the cackling lunatics in DS1, I feel like she really sells how scary hollowing is. And
Hmm.
the voice actress does a great job too. So quite possibly like the fan favorite NPC from this game. And I think you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, she's one of my favorite NPCs in like any Souls game. Like you were saying, her storyline of her, you kind of witness her kind of start to follow further throughout the journey, and yeah, your journeys are parallel. You're constantly seeing her and encountering her, and she helps you with some pretty key fights. I think Smelter Demon is one of them. Obviously, Flexile Sentry too.
The Rotten later on you can
Then
summon her for.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, because you see her in the gutter or Black Gulch.
Mhm.
But yeah, she's just so cool, and her. You also fight her brother later on, who she talks about. As you get to know her better. I think that's cool too. There's like you actually start to have conversations with her at each point you see her, and then yeah, you end up fighting her brother at Aldia's Keep later in the journey, which is another interesting fight.
Yeah, yeah. Aslatiel, I believe is his name, and yeah, kind of because that's our last encounter with Lucatiel. We don't kind of hard to say what happens. Maybe she goes hollow
Mm,
after that, but kind of an interesting implication there because she, like you said, she talks about her brother and how he was the superior fighter, or he was the sort of superior like swordsman. And it's interesting that right after we find her in that hut, like really starting to approach hollowing, are invaded by him in that opening hallway, like the
mhm,
foyer of Aldia's keep. So kind of makes you wonder,
mhm.
like, did she fight him and not know who he was? Or like, I don't know. It's
Mm,
yeah, really cool quest though. Great quest.
mhm. And then yeah, Flexile Sentry.
Hmm.
I again another really interesting boss from a design perspective. Maybe not the most difficult boss. I think you just kind of have to you make sure that I forget which side it is the more easy one to deal with. I think it's not the swords one. It's the like spiked club. It's the other
Yes.
side like a spiked club. So it's pretty just easy to kind of like bait out certain attacks and take down the sentry pretty quickly. But I do like that as the battle goes on, the water level
Yeah.
continues to rise,
Yep.
eventually like affecting your mobility around the arena, which is literally just the basement or the hull of the ship, which is super cool. So yeah, no, I always enjoy fighting the sentry. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's a great call. Like you said, it's not maybe the most memorable boss fight, but it's an example of clever design, right? Like the water level slowly rising, and then going all the way back to Demon Souls, like the tutorial, the Journey to the Nexus, where you fight the Vanguard demon. If you're a Soulsborne player, you've just learned to like, oh, I'm gonna roll or strafe behind this big boss and hit their back. And Flexile Sentry kind of turns that on its head, in addition to this like subtle
Mhm.
environmental hazard. And then, you defeat the Flexile Sentry and ride the prison ship out, into the sea. So yeah, I feel like the game's really shining like at this, at this stage.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's starting to like hit its stride,
Yep.
especially going to the Bastille, which leads to a couple of, in my opinion, the better boss fights of the game.
Yeah, in Bastille again, I feel is one of the best designed levels in the game. This opening chapter, as you think back on it, from like Forest of Fallen Giants to Hyde's Tower to Wharf to Bastille, is like pretty strong in terms
Hmm.
of design and just the aesthetics of this old gray prison jutting out of the sea with gargoyles flying overhead. It's just badass.
Hmm.
Yeah, we have there's the Belfry Luna portion of the Bastille, which it
Hmm.
has like this sort of nostalgic gargoyle boss battle, but it more serves as like a PvP zone for the Bellkeeper's Covenant. There's Ruin Sentinels, which I think flavor text also leads
Hmm.
us to believe like the Ruin Sentinels, like there's not humans in those armor sets. Those are like inanimate as well, kind of like the golems. So that seems to be like a real
Hmm.
theme in the game. Like we don't really get straight answers, but there was clearly like a lot of experimenting with like souls and sort of like, what constitutes life and things like that. There's also McDuff, the blacksmith. We were talking about,
Oh
the
yeah.
bastard in Majula. I always prefer to give McDuff my business.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's more akin to like the Andre. He gives more
Yeah.
Andre vibes, you know.
Yeah, and then the exploding hollows here are probably some of the more rage-inducing enemies that
Yeah.
From has ever designed. And again, we
Hmm.
know that Aldia seemed to like have his hand in the Bastille. Flavor text tells us these hollows they were experimented on by Aldia, which made their souls like highly unstable, hence the explosions. So, right, again, the game doesn't flesh this out in a very straightforward manner, but I think probably left to conclude that Aldi and Vendrick were very interested in manipulating souls, almost like going back to Demon Souls and this idea of like the souls arts. Like maybe they believed the answer to escaping the cycle was in the soul or something. But yeah, as we make our way deeper and deeper into the Bastille, we meet its most famous prisoner and our first old soul, the Last Sinner.
Yeah, the descent, rather ascent from Sinner's Rise, like getting up there and then taking the elevator all the way down to, basically like the dungeons down in the like waterway system of the Bastille is just so cool. I just always have loved that kind of that progression down into the waterways, and then obviously the waterways themselves are kind of annoying to navigate, but then you finally make your way to the like actual walk up to where the Lost Center is held, and there's the two paths where you can go like the torches to like the boss room, which I think is a really kind of unique mechanical thing. Like if you can keep a torch lit from the up top of the tower all the way down through the waterways, you're rewarded by the ability to light these two torches, which will light up the whole boss room. Is just kind of interesting design.
Yeah, I always really liked that as well. And like you were saying, the build up, I think there's great build up at this point because you kind of sense like Sinner's Rise, and obviously a reference to the Lost Sinner, but kind of feels like these are the real doldrums of the Bastille. Like the Bastille is a pretty
Hmm.
bleak place, but you get down into these flooded cells and yeah,
Hmm.
full of the exploding hollows. And then Right. There's this interesting mechanic where you really couldn't know how to do this on a first playthrough. You would almost have to do it on New Game Plus, but where you can preserve the light in the Sinner's boss arena because otherwise you go into that arena and with a swing of her sword, she snuffs out the sort of torches in that room and the fights in the dark, which is actually kind of cooler, I think.
Hmm.
It's a cool boss fight. It's kind of like an easier version of Alon. I was reminded of that playing through Broom Tower recently. It almost feels like she is practice for Alon because it's like melee attack, backstep,
Hmm.
melee attack, backstep. And one of the more overt DS1 references in the game, because we were talking about this idea of like these old souls and they sort of find new hosts every generation or whatever. And the Sinner is currently the host of the Witch of Izalith's soul. One of the more overt DS1 references in the game is when that little chaos parasite crawls into her eye and starts the fight.
Oh yeah, that's right. I
Hmm.
didn't even think about that.
Yeah, you're a pretty big fan of this fight and just kind of this moment in
Oh
general,
yeah.
right?
Hmm. Yeah, it's not. I think you kind of nailed it with it being kind of an easier Elan, but for where you're at in the game, for at least for a first playthrough, this feels like a true fight. It feels like a
Yeah.
really dynamic battle. It's one of the kind of first battles. I know we kind of glossed over Rune Sentinels, but I think that's kind of they're an interesting fight in the sense that it's obviously a gank fight. There's three of them, one of you, but it's kind of an interesting setup for the Lost Sinner fight in the sense that it's like three Sentinel knights that are very mechanical in the ways
Mhm.
that they fight. They're really easy to read. There's the age-old strat of them kind of you staying on that first platform up top and having them jump up to
Yeah.
you. And it feels very methodical and like everything is kind of linear with that fight, at least in my mind. And then you get to Lost Sinner and she's kind of like she starts to move and she's kind of sporadic. She's jumping all over. And yeah, chances are you're fighting her in the dark too. So it's kind of like
Hmm.
hyper chaotic versus earlier in the level you're fighting these like very orderly rune sentinels. So you get that kind of those two dynamic offerings from boss fights in the Bastille.
And I appreciate that you called out that platform that you start the Ruined Sentinels boss fight on.
Yeah.
I always liked that. Right off the bat, you
Yeah.
have to make a decision because there's no way to get back up there. So it's like, do you stay here or do you drop down onto the main floor? And it's just
Hmm.
also one of, I think, the best music tracks in the game. It's reused for Smelter Demon, but that's like one of Yuka Kitamura's, I think, first pieces she composed for FromSoft is the Ruined Sentinels theme, and it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Yuka, it's interesting you bring up Yuka. This is a bit of an aside, but I was just talking with a friend of mine who works in the music industry. He works for a record label, and there's a publication he follows. I forget what it's called, but he stumbled upon an interview with Yuka Kitamura, and it's just so interesting to like hear someone else's perspective on like her music when she's just such like a staple. Obviously, she's moved on and it's really sad to see her go, but it's her influence on all the scores that we've seen in all of our favorite games. For me, specifically Sekiro, I think she was at the helm. Yeah, just want to give her flowers there because she's one of the biggest reasons why I've been so drawn to these games.
Yeah, that's a great shout out. That media outlet is actually called Toon Glue because I shared that same interview, which is pretty new, in my
Oh,
Discord
really?
server a couple days ago. Yeah, yeah, and it's really cool because she pretty much just reflects on her experiences with FromSoft, and yeah, she was co-composer on DS2, DS3. She was the lead composer on Sekiro. I think she did some tracks on Bloodborne as well. Obviously, Elden Ring. And when you just think about the fact that like she composed the DS3 theme, she composed the Sekiro theme.
Hmm.
She did like the whole Sekiro soundtrack. Her fingerprints are all over these games, and they just wouldn't be what they are without her work. And I think, she established enough of like a legacy that other composers in a way it's like big shoes to fill, but I also think they'll be able to because like she created such an amazing blueprint and she really elevated these games with her music. But obviously everybody has their own preferences. But for me, up until this point, DS2 was my favorite soundtrack, and
Hmm.
probably because of her contributions, because it's her and Motoi Sakuraba who was the composer for DS1. And Sakuraba has, I think, more compositions than her, but she kind of like gets her feet wet with DS2, and it's a bit more exciting and bombastic than the previous game, you know? So
Mhm.
yeah, it definitely like gave you a sense of where things were heading with like Bloodborne and DS3.
I I just pulled up the interview with her, and she's asked the question, "Are there any video game soundtracks you wish you wrote?" To which he responded, "Harvest Moon," which a classic. Everyone loves the music in Harvest Moon. But she also mentions Professor Layton, which is one of
That's
my
cool.
all-time favorite series. The puzzle games on the Nintendo DS. So the fact that Kitamura likes Professor Layton, that's another a plus for Kitamura in my books. She's a fan of Professor Layton, so little fun fact there. But
I think she also said
I'm
her
really
first, maybe like her first video game was F-Zero, which I appreciated that as an F-Zero fan as
mm,
well. And yeah, I think the interview asked her, maybe like what piece were you most proud of, or what piece was like the most fulfilling to compose or something. She actually said the DS3 like overture, which I thought
oh,
was
that's so cool.
yeah, which again, that she, did that again in Sekiro, and where DS2
Hmm.
has that beautiful piano piece, and obviously there's a track like A Moment's Peace in DS1. Like there's these really memorable kind of like compositions in the games that came before Dark Souls 3. But I feel like she set a new standard with that DS3 theme. Like she gave the game like a
Hmm.
theme, and it feels like, it's evocative in a way where the more and more you play the game, you just intrinsically associate the ebbs and flow of that piece of music with like moments in the game and the themes of the game.
Hmm.
So it's kind of cool that even though she's moved on after
Hmm.
many years working for From, like every time somebody boots up those games, like they're always going to hear her theme. So that's cool. And yeah, just to tie things off, we're on this tangent because DS2 is the game where many of us were first introduced to Yuka and her incredible music. So major shout out to both her and Motoi Sakuraba. At this point in our DS2 journey, we've put down the Lost Sinner. We're a little stronger, we're a little more confident. I think we're going to
Hmm.
descend into the giant pit in the middle of Majula, which
No,
we are. No, no,
no,
but we are now.
no,
Um,
no, anything but
But
the
but I
pit.
mean, come on though. On its surface, is that not great design though? Like literally just putting a hole in the center of town that
Yeah,
tempts us and tempts
it's
us
so
until we
cool.
finally dive in.
Yeah, and then some foolish NPC named Gilligan who makes ladder just so happens to make ladders is like, hey, I'll sell you ladders to go down into this hole.
What
It's
an
just so
opportunist. Gilligan, whose
so
corpse
silly.
whose corpse is in the profane capital in Dark Souls 3.
Yeah, yeah, one of the that's just
Gilligan.
such a good callback because it's of course he's at the top of this platform that has the longest ladder I think I've ever had to ascend, period.
Right. And it's like, who could
It's
have been
just
responsible for this handiwork? Oh.
oh no, it's Gilligan.
Which it maybe
R.I.P.
gets you, I mean, this is a crazy side tangent, but it gets you thinking like, I guess somehow, who knows how many hundreds or thousands of years later, Gilligan ends up in like Irithyll dungeon as a prisoner and then maybe tries to escape and dies, but built some ladders that we get to, take advantage of. But um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting how Gilligan can make the pit a little more accessible as the game goes on. But right off the bat,
Mhm.
who doesn't test that, right? Who doesn't try to fall down into the
No,
hole?
of course.
You need more
Hmm.
HP, or you need the silver cat ring or the flying feline boots.
Hmm.
You need something to help you get down there. So we descend and we reach Grave of Saints, and I think this was
Hmm.
my guess is this was probably like Drangleic's catacombs at some point, kind of like catacombs of Carthus, but it's been overrun
Hmm.
by the greatest covenant in the game, the Rat Covenant,
Oh yeah.
and the Gutter, which is the next layer down as we continue our descent. It's
Hmm.
very clearly the Valley of Defilement slash Blighttown location in DS2. You were in the Gutter today, so I'm just going to let you take it from here because you were playing through this level today.
Well, I'm gonna preface this by saying my show notes for the pit just state fight rat guy, head to the gutter, hate it, head to Black Gulch, hate it, head to the rotten, hate it. So yeah, I didn't I never have a good time coming down this way. The gutter, I guess you got to give it credit for being probably the most complex like maze, or what feels like the most complex maze in the game. Mostly because it's pitch black in there, so you
Mhm.
definitely need your torches, which is cool. And then you're just on these like big wooden, poorly constructed wooden platforms with a bunch of bridges interconnecting them. If you don't know the line, if you don't know how to get from point A to point B, in the gutter, you're gonna dislike it immediately because you fall to your death all the time, you get poisoned all the time, and there's the bomb exploding hollows that'll just blow up and knock you off the bridge all the time. So yeah, lots of pain, lots of trial and error, but yeah, once you conquer it, it's definitely a good feeling getting out of there.
Did you know? I actually don't know if on current patch and Scholar it's still there, but at least at one time, maybe in the vanilla game, there was a Heineken beer can in the gutter.
No way,
I'm dead
seriously? Like
serious. Yes.
in one of
I believe there
in
was
one of
also
the
like a pickup
textures?
truck tire too. I think like as much as these games have a reputation for being like hard and punishing, I think we continue to like underestimate like Miyazaki and Tanimura's like senses of humor. And like we know that Miyazaki and FromSoft games in general always in some way at some point focus on this like Lovecraftian idea of everything seeping to the bottom, of there being like a mystery to solve
Mhm.
or a revelation to discover at like the very depths of something. And this place is like literally just a dump of hollows. You can almost imagine Miyazaki walking by Tanimura's computer during development, seeing this level and telling him to like add the poison spitting statues.
Yep.
But then even deeper beyond the gutter, the true basement of Drangleic is Black Gulch. It's a pretty
hmm
short level.
hmm
I think how short it is, it feels a little odd, like playing through it today. I mean, again, I'm a little desensitized because I've been playing this game for 10 years, but it's like, yeah, it's
hmm
a really short level, but I also don't know that it needed to be longer because I think it already tests the player's patience enough, especially coming off the gutter. But yeah, like at the end,
Right.
we meet the Rotten, who possesses Nito's soul. And in like my own head canon, and I know a lot of people share this belief, it's never confirmed in the game. I've always thought of this the Rotten as probably being the sunken king in some way. Like even though the Rotten is this collection of corpses, kind of reminiscent of like the Adjudicator or the Leechmonger or the Dirty Colossus from Demon Souls. I almost feel like its
Mm-hmm.
consciousness maybe could be the sunken king who we know essentially just drowned in poison. But yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts on our second old one here?
I don't hate the Rotten. I think it's a horrifically it's a horrifying monster. Like its design is spot on for the area in which it resides for sure. You're in this boss arena that's in the pits of the pit, as low as you can get, and there's just fire everywhere, and this giant pile of corpses is attacking you. It's probably the easiest of the Great One fights, in
Hmm.
my opinion, but it's an experience. Like it definitely feels fitting to kind of cap off the kind of horrific journey through the gutter and through the Black Gulch. It's like, of course, I'd be fighting this giant pile of just rotting corpses. Like what? Like what else? What else would I be dealing with here? It's definitely the rotten.
It's like trying to rebuild one of those statues when you walk in and like interrupt it and it gets
Mhm.
really angry. It's just it's
Yeah.
for a mass of corpses, it actually has quite a bit of personality. But
hmm
yeah, it's a pretty disgusting moment.
hmm
Couple disgusting hours here in your ride through DS2.
Yeah. I will say there's a moment in the Black Gulch because you can like roll off one of the like the side of the cliff heading through the Black Gulch, and you'll enter this room that has a chest. I forget what's in the chest, but there are these two like giant enemies
Hmm.
down there, and you don't have to fight them. You can run past them, or like you can, take the little elevator that leads you back up top. But if you defeat them, you get a key. I forget which key it is, or what it's called, but it's like the forgotten key or whatever. And I just think that's really interesting design. That in order to get a super specific key that actually leads you to, there's a chest in the gutter where you can get Hovel's armor. The only way you can get it is by defeating these two enemies in this random spot in the Black Gulch. I just think that's really kind of interesting, and it leads you to this kind of completionist mentality where, like, and I think you kind of described this during your recent playthroughs on YouTube, which I enjoyed all three of your DLC playthroughs. But you really need to take time with these areas, and I think for me at least, coming from a background in Dark Souls 3 where I'm prone to learning level, learning how to fight these enemies, but then also having the freedom to kind of run through the level. That's not really the case in a lot of these Dark Souls 2 areas. And your exploration is rewarded through combat a lot of the time. Like you'll get certain enemies that drop specific items, like this key from these two completely seemingly random enemies that some people might just completely avoid. You get rewarded with Havel's armor set, one of the best armor sets in the game. So I just thought that was kind of a neat little aside that if you kind of assume this kind of completionist mentality of like taking a little bit slower and like really engaging with all the enemies in these levels, you will be rewarded.
Yeah, that's a great call out, man. I believe the key is called the Forgotten Key. And yeah, you
Yeah.
make a great point. Like just trying to figure out what door that key opens is a puzzle in and of itself. And yeah, there's a lot of little things like that
Hmm.
that DS2 does that I do appreciate. Hey, a couple interesting notes though about this because you know mentioning that key, you kind of jogged my memory. The last giant is falsely named because there's two more living giants down in Black Gulch, but who would know, right? Because
Right.
it's the total depths. But I believe, yeah, these are the only other two living giants we find in the entire game. You
Mhm.
also, I believe, trying to think down there, maybe that's where you get the Dragon Talon, which is essentially the key that gets you to Shulva, the DLC, which if it's a
Mm.
Dragon Talon, I'm assuming it's a remnant of Sin, which sort
Hmm.
of again reinforces my belief that in some way the Rotten and the Sunken King are probably connected. But and then lastly, we cannot fail to mention, as you were saying, dropping down, finding secrets. We mentioned Lucatiel's hidden here, which I think when you're doing Lucatiel's quest, if you don't know the game well, this is a really easy spot to miss Lucatiel. But as you're dropping down and trying to find secrets in Black Gulch, you also can find Dark Diver Grandal, who is the
Mm.
leader
Yep.
of the Pilgrims of Dark, which is
Hmm.
this abyss dark oriented covenant. I think, I always next to Rat Covenant, which was kind of a meme covenant, let's be honest. But like Pilgrims of the Abyss has a lot of content associated with it though. And
Hmm.
and yeah, I don't know really what to say about Grandal because we don't know much about him, but it kind of feels like this whole area, like meeting Grandal, he's in this wheelchair, the body horror with the rotten. It does kind of feel like some of the FromSoft team was just like looking at Bloodborne on the screens across the office and was like, let's use some of these ideas in our game too, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, and I never completed that quest line, so I still haven't fought. What's the
Yeah.
yeah, Dark Lurker. I still haven't fought Dark Lurker yet, so maybe I'll try to give that a go in this.
The dark chasms of old, which are these, several levels you have to play through to get to Dark Lurker. Oh, they're so ganky and trolly, and it's I
Mm.
can't say it's fun. You get a really incredible hex though from the Dark Lurker's Soul Life Drain patch. And in Dark Lurker, yeah, I don't know if there's, I guess we could just touch on Dark Lurker real quick. I don't know if there's a
Mhm.
lot to say about Dark Lurker, but it's this very angelic looking boss. I sort of feel like it's just a creation of the abyss, but it's primarily a magic boss. So it's casting at you. I don't know, Black Gulch, I guess it just goes back to like this area. This level is really short, but it has a little more verticality than you'd think with the dropping off the cliff sides.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just completely flat. Like you're just running from
Right.
bonfire straight into boss fight. So yeah, it is nice having this kind of like secret, hidden kind of verticality to this level.
Well, I would say let's go back up to Majula. We've taken out two old ones. Let's split off in another direction. Why don't we go to Huntsman's Copse? I weirdly don't enjoy playing through this level very much. I do think there's some really cool
Mhm.
enemy designs here, though, and the flavor text for the undead lockaway key is really interesting, and it actually tells us a ton about what the deal is with this area. So it says, key to the prison in Huntsman's Copse. The undead hunts during the reign of the old Iron King took place in this forest, and the cells in
Hmm.
which the undead were held still stand there to this day. However, the march of time has eroded any difference between the captors and the captives. So
Hmm.
if we weren't already led to believe the old Iron King was evil enough, he was apparently just hunting undead at
Yeah.
this place and presumably like chilling in the mansion, when he wasn't out in the woods. Yeah, I don't know, doing whatever he was doing to these undead. So yeah, like I always liked the kind of green skybox in this area and a lot of birds in the
Hmm.
distance. It's a cool vibe. I just don't really enjoy playing through it very much.
Yeah, it's always just kind of it just feels like an in between, right? Like it does yield a couple kind of the two kind of gimmicky bosses, right, in the Skeleton Lords and the Chariot. But yeah, it just feels kind of like you're passing through. There's nothing too complex. Again, we were just talking about verticality. There's little to no verticality in this area. It's just kind of winding through this kind of spooky forest area. So, yeah, I can kind of agree with you that there's nothing too exciting. Nothing really stands out about this area beyond the two kind of goofy bosses.
Totally. I really subscribe to like that John Romero classic Doom level design philosophy that circles are boring, straight lines are boring, horseshoes are interesting. And when you
Mhm.
start thinking about that, or you put that lens over FromSoft's games, you realize a lot of the best FromSoft games, or levels rather, feature horseshoe designs. And even in a level like this that I don't enjoy very much, and I'm with you, it feels very flat, there is sort of a horseshoe, kind of an almost an S shape to it. But yeah, that doesn't really save it in my mind. Like you said, it is pretty flat, and I think that makes you really appreciate areas like we were talking about, like Cardinal Tower and Bastille and No Man's Wharf, where there's just tons of up and down.
Mhm.
That just you start to realize like, oh yeah, those are the ingredients that make levels either enjoyable or not enjoyable. So
Mhm.
yeah, a lot of just flat openness here. There's all you mentioned Skeleton Lords, and people always rag on that boss. I don't know, I guess it's fine. And then Executioner's Chariot, which is a gimmick
Mhm.
boss. It's a boss a lot of people hate. I think I actually kind of like it to some degree, but I've just
Mhm.
noticed in general, I feel like as I'm getting older and the more and more I play these games over the years, the more I feel like I'm turning into kind of a gimmick boss weirdo where like I'm getting kind of burn out on the big dudes with big swords, and I love me a gimmick boss, you know? I know you and I have talked about this before, but they just do so much to break up the pace, of these games, and often the
Mhm.
gimmick bosses are the really memorable ones too. So
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to say other than that.
Yeah, I think we both feel similarly in that regard. Like for me, Praetor Rykard in Elden Ring is such a high point, even though that's, it's the Yorm fight. It's the you just get the Storm Ruler and win fight. I live for a good gimmicky fight because yeah, it breaks up the pacing. It's something fresh. It's not just another thing you can brute force or use the tactics you've already been using the rest of your playthrough. You have to kind of switch things up a bit and at least approach it from a different perspective, even if it's just, in the Chariot's case, run from one alcove to the next
All
and
right.
then it dies. It's like, but yeah, I like the Chariot as well because it's worth the visit. Like I'll always coming through
Mhm.
here, I'll pop by. It's a little aside, but I'll pop by and experience that fight just for the visuals and just to kind of run around the arena.
Yeah, well, and then you also can access the Brotherhood of Blood Covenant after you defeat the Chariot, which is another. I mean, really, all the covenants are super cool in DS2. I think anybody who knows anything about DS2 knows that despite its polarizing reputation, it has really good online play, and the covenants are awesome.
Mhm.
And from what I've sensed playing on PlayStation in the last couple of years, the online community is still super duper active. And Titchy Gren, the NPC associated with that covenant, has a pretty great armor set too. It's not really armor; it's more of like robes and a hood. But I always dug
Mhm.
that set.
Yeah, I haven't really, delved too far into the PvP aspect of DS2, but for a lot of the PvP channels I watch or like content I watch on YouTube, a lot of them return to Dark Souls 2 pretty frequently just because it is very different. And I think it goes back to, that kind of, the idea that I've expressed to you multiple times is that the combat is very turn-based
Hmm.
in flavor, and that apply. I can imagine that applies to PvP tenfold, and that every second, every move, every button press counts tremendously. Like it's very easy to recover in my PvP experiences in Elden Ring, and I love the pace of the Elden Ring PvP, but it's easy to like kind of get out of sticky situations at times. Where I can imagine PvP for DS2 is just it's got to be super hardcore. It's got to be
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
completely different mentality going into those types of battles, those duels.
Yeah, and I've always thought the Brotherhood of Blood kind of feels like the follow-up to the Dark Wraith Covenant in DS1. Like it's just pure PvP invasion. I think the idea is like you're just spilling blood for the is it Nar Alma, the blood god that Tichy Grand
Mm,
worships. So yeah, just pure PvP gameplay. But yeah, worth just yeah, a quick shout out to Covenants in DS2. Skeleton Lords, Executioner's Chariot. We got a Covenant in the zone. It's kind of flat, whatever. We're moving on. We make our way to Harvest Valley, which I think we'll probably agree is
mhm,
one of the more iconic areas in the game. One of the more, again, kind of going back to like Cardinal Tower, Bastille, one of the more fleshed out areas in the game.
mhm,
And we navigate through this like rugged, poisonous canyon of sorts, leading to a giant windmill, and at the top of which we meet Mytha, the baneful queen, who
mhm.
may have been betrothed to the old Iron King. I don't know. The game is like pretty ambiguous about that, but kind of like with Flexile Sentries, there's an interesting mechanic with the poison levels in her room. What do you think about Harvest Valley?
I'm a big fan of just the kind of evolution that you feel going from leaving the Skeleton Lord's boss room, going through that kind of like canyon, opening up into Harvest Valley, seeing the like poison kind of mines or whatever, the quarry, the poison quarry or whatever it is. It feels like a poison level done right because like there's so much to explore and you're rewarded for exploring even though if, they might just be like suicide runs. You like you see the items, you run out there and you grab them and you die or whatever, do it again. There's this sense of like it's worth traversing this poisonous terrain. It feels way more cohesive, way more interconnected. There's actually some pretty interesting enemies to fight, like the pyromancers, the bigger the beasts that they ride too.
Yeah, yeah, the
Um,
mounted big brutes. That's an
yeah,
awesome anime design.
yeah, so that it just feels a little bit more inspired than a lot of or some of the other areas, and I really like the kind of transition from Harvest Valley going into the Earthen Peak. What feels like a true dungeon. Like I always have looked at Earthen Peak as kind of equating it to like the quote unquote legacy dungeons of Elden Ring. It just feels like it kind of has everything. It's pretty tight. It's like I feel like it's condensed, but it's got the verticality. There are tons of rooms to go through. There are tons of kind of hidden passageways. And then, yeah, well, to your point, you can Mitha, who you fight later, and you can actually interact with her boss room by lighting the windmill on fire, which then stops I guess, the production or lowers the levels of poison in her boss room. I don't really know how that works out, but there's that kind of interesting mechanic that impacts the boss fight.
If memory serves, I think you can actually just summon Jester Thomas for that fight, and he'll just solo her. Like you don't even really need to do anything. He's so OP, which that's kind of
Oh,
funny.
that's so funny.
Yeah, there's also a funny detail next time you're in that room. Look at the ceiling. The ceiling is like gorgeous. It almost looks like it's from Hyde's Tower of Flame. And there's just, yeah, from stuff like that to the, yeah, being able to like manipulate the level. There's just a lot of interesting,
Mhm.
I don't know, little facets of DS2. But I like your point about how this almost feels like a precursor to Legacy Dungeons. Yeah, I agree completely. And that probably has its roots in like Sen's Fortress, and then this kind of feels
Mhm.
like the
Yep.
Sen's Fortress of DS2. And then, of course, by the time like,
Mhm.
Hirata State and then and Elden Ring, they just keep getting more and more grandiose. But yeah, we unfortunately, though, I think we're at the end of Earthen Peak. So we have to talk about what happens after Earthen Peak.
Okay.
So,
I
so
guess I'll just I'll check out for this one, and you'll I'll return after the Iron Keep section is done. How about
hey,
that?
you do what you need to do. But I feel like before we even
Yeah,
get to Iron Keep, we have to talk about the elevator. You have to.
yeah.
You
Well, I
can't talk
think.
about DS2 at that time. You have to talk about the elevator. So we're
Mhm.
at the top of a windmill, right? And we find
Uh-huh.
we're in this like poisonous canyon, and we're at the top of
Mm,
a windmill in that canyon, and there's an elevator. Well, it must lead down, right? No, it goes up. And when we step
mhm.
out of that elevator, we find ourselves at a castle in a volcano. So I think not only is this
Uh,
the most ridiculous piece of evidence in the entire game of its developmental challenges that quite clearly some levels were
Hmm.
shuffled around during development. But in my opinion, Iron Keep is the worst level in the entire game. Like I rarely will
Hmm.
say that I believe something is objectively bad. I'm usually very, you go back to my channel, any video or podcast I've done for 3 years now, I'm usually always like, hey, this is just my opinion. This is just my preference. I do objectively believe that Iron Keep is bad.
Hmm.
Like I really dislike the pathway design itself. Like the pathways are pretty weird and nonsensical and not in like a cool, abstract, classic Doom way. Like I think they're just poorly done and there's no flow to the level at all.
Hmm.
So you suffer through mobs of cut and paste Alon Knights with insane poise who sprint at you by, the two or three numbers of them. It's awful. It was
Hmm.
awful in 2014, and I think it's awful in 2024.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm thinking back to like my first playthrough, and I feel like I kind of powered through Earthen Peak maybe a little earlier than I should have. Partially because I think the bosses, at least leading up to Iron Keep, aren't that difficult
Mm-mm.
by comparison to like other routes. So getting to Iron Keep like relatively early in a playthrough, like taking down skeleton lords and Mitha, the Baneful Queen, not that difficult to do. Especially I have never summoned in the Jester, but apparently the Jester can just do the work for you, and then taking down the skeleton lords is pretty easy too. Obviously a ganky fight, but easy to endure. So going from that to Iron Keep, where the Alon Knights can pretty easily just like two shot you early on, and they're fast, and they're like 20 of them in confined quarters, leading up to the Smelter Demon. You're just like, which I think is a fun fight, but like early on, dealing with all the Alon Knights, and then eventually getting into the boss room, and it's the Smelter Demon. You're like, yeah, I don't know what's going on here anymore. A little bit, but yeah, it's the design of Iron Keep is, yeah.
When we were talking about No Man's Wharf, how that level is a little ganky too, but how the design of it sort of saves it. You don't
Hmm.
mind the mobs and some of the snipers and some of the dogs as much because
Hmm.
it's just fun to navigate that big horseshoe going up and down with all the little buildings to explore and a bunch of NPCs. Yeah, that's more your memory of it versus the mobs. And I feel like this is a like that's just a
Hmm.
reminder of how much the flow of a level matters. And there's just
Hmm.
no flow in Iron Keep. Like
Hmm.
everything's like a T. Like you go down a pathway and you're like a dead end and you have to like go left or right. And
Yep.
then you just never really like get up to speed, which, like a game like Sekiro is all about that. You're just always flowing and zipping and running and jumping. And even though this isn't that, there's a lot of levels in the Souls games that have great flow. And this is not one of them. And
Hmm.
and like you said, the Smelter Demon is, you'll hear that criticism of DS2 a lot. Big boss, little room. This is an
Hmm.
example of that. I don't mind the Smelter Demon. I actually think the Smelter Demon's like a far better boss battle than Old Iron King. But like you said,
Hmm.
it's a crazy reality check at this point in the game. And there's that, this might be a fair time too, just to mention the sort of strange mechanic in DS2 that doesn't reappear in any of the other games, where enemies only respawn a certain number of times after you kill them. So
Yep.
you can actually repeat, and I don't remember if it's like 10, 12, 15, but if you kill a given enemy in
Mhm.
a level X amount of times, they will stop respawning permanently unless you restoke the bonfire or start a new game cycle. And I remember back many, many years ago when YouTube guides and wikis just weren't as prevalent. This game was pretty new. I mean, I knew people who were doing that on this level. Like they were going through and just cleansing
Mhm.
this level of knights because they couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle it. So they were just spitefully killing every knight repeatedly for like 3 hours on this level, which I don't
Mhm.
know what's worse, doing that or just slogging through it. But oh yeah, Iron Keep, it leaves a
Yeah,
bad taste in your mouth.
I'm pretty sure on my first playthrough, that's how I found out about that mechanic, was because I had to deal with this level so many times that all of a sudden I was like, wait, that enemy just didn't spawn again. Like I just organically found that mechanic because I had to deal with those knights that many times.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. Well, we got the old Iron King, our third old one at the end of this level. And I guess Smelter Demon is like just sort of a creation of maybe Broom Tower or the old Iron King. Kind of, there's almost
Mhm.
an implication in the flavor text that maybe the Smelter Demon killed the Iron King, like threw him into the lava. I don't know. I don't
Mm.
even know that it matters, but the implication is like the old Iron King was essentially swallowed by the lava. He was like this very greedy, evil conqueror, swallowed by the lava around his keep, and then in some way like comes into contact with Gwen's soul. And I guess in the lava becomes this like the Balrog thing that you fight at the
Mhm.
end of the level, which I've also believed there's some text that maybe the old Iron King was trying to create a dragon, kind of like Aldia. And I think like Aldia
Mm.
probably succeeded and Iron King didn't, and he might have just become this like weird creature. Yeah, it's a pretty bad boss battle, in my
Yeah.
opinion. Like kind of like we were saying, like
Mhm.
Sinner and Rotten are like fine. They're not terribly hard. They're fine enough. I just think this boss is such a like a letdown. Like given how epic the landscape is and how imposing he looks, it's
Mhm.
really underwhelming where you just like bait his hand and then hit it repeatedly until he dies. Like there's just not much to say about it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I think they really wanted to keep the scale of the old Iron King because it's cool like walking into that boss room and seeing this giant like yeah, Balrog looking demon. And unfortunately that comes at the cost of, well, how are we going to fit him in this boss room and how are we going to how are we going to like make up for that incredible size within a move set? And it just didn't come together how they might have wanted to. Because keeping us on that like tiny little ledge surrounded by lava just completely hindered any possibility of this
Yeah.
becoming like, I mentioned earlier Rykard. That's a perfect example of an enormous boss, but you've got all the world around you to like move around him and fight with him. And, his moveset isn't overly complex by any means, but by putting the old Iron King in the middle of a lava lake and you on effectively a tiny fraction of an island because of a boss fog wall, you just immediately hinder any capability or any possibility of this becoming a fight at all. It's a pretty bad way to wrap up a pretty bad area. So
Right.
not
Well, and it goes back to the
not great.
flow stuff that I was talking about. Like even with the boss, you have nowhere to move. Like there's just
Yeah.
yeah, it just never feels good in this level. And I had always wished, and who knows, maybe the FromSoft team had ideas that they just weren't able to execute on. But I'd always wished this was almost more like I'm not saying Dragon God from Demon Souls is the best gimmick battle, but you could almost imagine like
Mhm.
a way better version of this battle where you have a bunch of room to move around this lava field and maybe like Dragon
Mhm.
God, there's like a gimmick with, I don't know, there's like pots of water throughout, Iron Keep. Maybe there's some kind of gimmick where kind of like Dragon God, you're trying to sprint to certain points to activate something to damage the boss. And so many ways this could have been better, but we get the old soul, and yeah, we're definitely heading back to Majula now. I
Mhm.
suppose we should probably break off towards Shaded Woods now,
Mhm.
but yeah, I feel like in general, this for me, this is where the base game starts to drag a little bit, like coming out of and again, you can
Mhm.
do some of these areas in a different order, but
Mhm.
yeah, just coming off of Iron Keep and kind of heading into the woods, and I'm definitely missing like the tighter design of the earlier portion of the game.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that. Although I will say I like the Shaded Woods is a very interesting area because it's again the one of the strengths of DS2 is in the settings in the different areas in the different biomes. Like the variation that is kind of on display in the different like environments themselves, I think is really cool. And the Shaded Woods being this big, foggy forest with a bunch of invisible assassins that can just kill you is such a trip the first time you go in there and you're like, what just happened? I just got backstabbed by a ghost. Like what's happening in here? So I like how each level feels exciting from at the very least, at the like bare minimum, like an aesthetic theme that is unique to that area.
I definitely agree with you there. And I think that is one of the clever things DS2 does, where you encounter enemies in the shaded woods that almost look like phantoms, as if you were playing online, and
Mhm.
just seeing other players kind of residually pass through your world, except they actually start attacking you and you can't lock on to them. And it is very clever. I guess to break down Shaded Woods a little bit, you sort of get to this like central bonfire that breaks off in a few different directions. So there's one path that takes us to Aldia's Keep, which, as we mentioned way earlier, that's blocked by King's Gate, so you can't currently get to it. There's another path that leads to the Shrine of Winter in Drangleic Castle. That's also blocked off. I think if you hit like 1,000,000 soul memory, you can get through it, or you need all the old souls. So we'll say we can't get
Oh,
through.
interesting.
Yeah, you can
I didn't
grind
realize
soul
that with
memory to do it.
the soul
Yep.
memory. Really? Huh.
hmm
Interesting.
But right, well, so we'll just say you can't pass through there right now either. So finally, there's this path into a really foggy forest, which we can take. That's what you were talking about. I feel like it's maybe a quick shout out to Vengarl, who's this like Pharazôn warrior
Oh
who,
yeah.
his,
Hmm.
I should say more specifically, we meet Vengarl's head because his head and body
Yeah.
become separated and both are still like sentient. And yeah, he's just a very
Mhm.
cool, memorable NPC. You can summon him for the final boss battle in the base game. Like, I don't know, I think Vengarl's
Mhm.
quest is worth going through, and another great
Mhm.
example of voice acting in this game, and just a lot of
Mhm.
interesting dialogue from him. And yeah, you can later find and battle his body in the Shaded Ruins. But yeah, we get through the foggy forest, we get to the Shaded Ruins, which I don't know. I mean, again, this is an interesting NPC zone because
Mhm.
we meet, oh my gosh, her name's escaping me, the Corvian blacksmith. I don't know why I can't think of her name right now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, what's her name? But the boss weapons from Happy Souls. Have you seen that? The
I have
clip?
not
Cue the
seen
clip from
this. It sounds like something I should
cue the
check
clip
out.
right now. Cue the clip right now from Happy Souls where she screams boss weapons.
I've got boss weapons!
All
Okay.
right, thank you, Tara. Thank you, editing Tara, for throwing that in. I'll send that video to you, dude. It's worthwhile. It's like this animated cartoon of two players playing through Dark Souls 2. But yeah, this really goofy Corvian blacksmith who, yeah, gets you boss weapons. Pretty cool.
Right. And then Dark Diver Grandal, he's here again. Tark, the man scorpion, which we need the Ring of Whispers to
Yes.
actually communicate
Hmm.
with. So again,
So cool.
this is a pretty interesting NPC zone. You know, the lions are really cool, but kind of like Huntsman's Cops, it's a pretty flat area. And there's just a bunch of those trolley curse pots. And yeah, it's just not a part of the game that gets me very excited, I guess.
Yeah, I think beyond the really cool NPCs that we encounter here, there's then not a ton going on.
Uh, Ornifex, Weaponsmith Ornifex. I had to look it
Yeah,
up.
weapons
It's
with
escaping me.
artifacts. Yeah, I'll send you that clip. Yeah, Happy Souls is so good. It's it's a classic, and yeah, the boss weapons with artifacts.
And Ornifex in general is just a pretty interesting character because, you know, the Corvians are enemies in the painted world in DS1. So when you see her, it's pretty surprising that she's not hostile. And she ends up moving to Brightstone Cove, which we'll talk about that. Her placement is so sadistic in Brightstone Cove. But she ends up in this room full of almost like, I don't know if they're carved or they're ceramic or they're stone, but like these little sort of human effigy style figures with these, I think, like cuts or holes in them, almost reminiscent of like the exploding hollows in Bastille.
Mm.
And again, I guess that's all kind of left up to your interpretation of like what's going on here, what's the significance. But it, you know, thinking about her, it reminded me we didn't give a shout out to Strait of Olifis when we talked about Lost Bastille, who is the other
Mm.
merchant who like transposes your boss souls into spells. And Strait is just one of my favorite NPCs in the game. His dialogue is incredible.
Yeah, Straight's so interesting. I love that he's in the weird part of the Bastille. Like he's in a cell, and then he's surrounded
Well, he's
by
petrified. Remember, you have
yeah,
to use a fragrant
yep.
branch of yore.
Yeah, you have to use the fragrant branch of yore, and then there's a bunch of hollows that are around him that aren't aggro, which I think is kind of interesting. I don't know if there's any reasoning behind that, but yeah, he's just chilling in the Bastille, which is
Well,
kind of interesting.
yeah, and like based on his dialogue, he'd been petrified for a really long time. Because he's got that line. He's like, Drangleic, is that what they call this place now? Good. Very good indeed. It's just like, what? But I feel like it gets to this idea that's really present in Dark Souls 2 about just like kingdoms rising and falling and this cycle of fire just continuing, that he is like kind of like madly jaded about it, where he just kind of wakes up and it's like,
Mm.
yeah, who knows what kingdom he was in. He's like, oh,
Hmm.
now this is called Drangleic. Oh, good, good. Yes, another kingdom, right? It's just he's I don't know, just some nice flavor from him,
Hmm.
for sure.
The mad sorcerer type of
Yes.
energy.
Yeah, jumping back to Shaded Ruins, Najka, the Scorpion Lady, is the final
Hmm.
boss of that area. A clear callback to Quelaag, from DS1.
Hmm.
I don't know, she's fine. She's all right.
Yeah, she's fine. She's definitely not the most difficult boss, especially if you bring in Tark, which is I do that every single time because I just think
Same.
it's so cool to like
It
get
feels
the ring,
appropriate.
talk to
Yeah.
Tark. Like if I can talk to this scorpion man and befriend him to go fight his betrothed or whatever, like let's do that for sure.
Yeah, and then this is another, in my opinion, slightly odd transition because after Najka, the next area is Doors of Pharaohs.
Hmm.
This area confuses me a bit because the Rat King Covenant has dominion over this area, yet it's
Hmm.
completely disjointed from Grave of Saints.
Right.
But then, like, the Gurm are here, which they're cool, like, their design is pretty iconic. But
Hmm.
yeah, it almost feels to me like this and Grave of Saints should have probably just been like one giant catacomb cave level instead of two separate smaller levels. One of which, this one, Doors of Pharaohs, is best remembered as a PvP zone, which it is a pretty hilarious PvP zone. Like you're so OP if you're
Hmm.
if you're PvPing in here. Like you have an army of rats, tons of booby traps, that really
Hmm.
memorable area with the ladder. Yeah, you just like kind of pity any player who gets stuck in there.
I've got four words for you though.
Okay.
Gavlan wheel, Gavlan deal.
Yes. Which,
The greatest merchant of all in FromSoft
yes,
history, Gavlan.
Gavlon, who we first meet in No Man's Wharf. I don't know if we mentioned
Oh,
that.
true.
Kind of
That's
funny,
true.
he's
Yeah.
just chilling there, which makes me think maybe he was like loaded up on the prison ship at one point or something, and we just, we find
Oh,
him
yeah.
chilling. Maybe he
Yeah.
escaped or something. Maybe he wheeled and dealed
Mm.
his way off that prison ship. Maybe he sold a few
Go-
poison arrows to the Flexile Sentry, and the Flexile Sentry was like, "You can be on your way. I didn't see anything." So, but then he also goes to Harvest Valley, where we can find him outside of Earthen Peak, and then, yeah, I
Mhm.
mostly associate him with Doors of Pharaoh. This Doors of Pharaoh,
Yeah.
this is kind of like his final spot. But also, Royal Rat Authority is the boss
Yeah,
here. Which,
we can skip that.
okay,
It's basically just Sith, but
toxic Sith,
stinky.
stinky Sith. Oh my
Yeah, yeah.
God.
Yep. My notes just say Sith if stinky.
That's great. That's what it should have been called, Stinky Sith. Because I don't even think we mentioned Royal Rat Vanguard, which is the boss in Grave of Saints, which
Hmm.
is a gimmick, pretty
Hmm.
annoying, also kind of hilarious that the only way you actually deplete the boss's HP bar is by attacking the Mohawk rat.
Hmm. Yeah, which I've
It's
got that one covered with rat but mohawk.
yes.
So we got Sith but stinky, and then the other one is rat but mohawk.
Maybe that's why Shibuya got fired. Maybe that was like his final contribution. Maybe they were in like a boardroom and he was like, the next
He
boss.
said,
He's like, wait for this. Wait for you guys ready? It's going to be a mob of rats, except one is going to have a mohawk. And maybe Miyazaki just like flipped the table over and was
"You
like,
just lost it."
get out of
He
here.
snapped.
You are done. I want to hear Poison Swamp,
Oh
nothing
no.
else. Get the hell out of here with your mohawk rats. Yeah, well, but that's what I'm getting at. It's so strange that these two levels are disjointed in the way they are. Like
Hmm.
the Royal Rat Authority and Royal Rat Vanguard
Right.
are in two separate areas, and then there's like it's a dead end. Like you can just kind of dead end at this point. But then like the
Hmm.
real progression is by heading into Brightstone Cove,
Hmm.
which is, I guess, like it feels a little bit maybe like an homage to Stonefang Tunnel and Demon Souls to me. Like it's like this mining town in Drangleic ran
Hmm.
by this duke who, I don't know, loved spiders, I guess, weirdo. It seems like
Hmm.
the mining and then these bright stones that the miners were unearthing, like that unleashed some kind of ancient evil that the game calls the Writhing Ruin, which
Hmm.
possessed the people and the Duke's spider Freya. And I feel like it's implied the Writhing Ruin is like either Seath or is connected to Seath somehow.
Interesting.
But yeah, I want to say in the Duke's chamber, which you find at the very end of the level, there's a cage in it, where we can maybe assume Freya was kept before she grew into this, possessed
Mm,
monster we fight. But yeah, I think
mm,
this is one of the cooler boss fights up until this point in the game. It feels pretty grand. And I think what's
mm.
interesting is that Freya in New Game drops, I guess, like her own soul, corrupted by this writhing ruin thing. But then in New Game Plus, drops the old Pale Drake's soul, which is clearly Seath's soul, like the Pale Drake. And then
Huh.
in Freya's arena, there's that old dragon wrapped in cobwebs, which later, when we get the Ashen Mist Heart and are able to experience lost memories, we can actually go into the memory of this dragon and see the world of Dark Souls, I'm guessing, like during the Age of Ancients, like, when the world was just gray and full of these stone dragons, and we can get the ancient Dragon Soul, which can be turned into like a really incredible curved great sword with ornifex. But yeah,
Mm,
this is all like pretty, I feel like it's pretty convoluted too, because Freya is not, it's not like old Iron King, where old Iron King is like the host of Gwyn's soul. Like Freya's just a
mm,
spider. Like she's just guarding
mm.
this area. So yeah, I don't know. It's a little confusing.
It is. I guess it does kind of come together because isn't there adjacent to Freya's boss room? There's like a little like study, right? There's a
Yeah, the
little
Duke's
study
chamber.
room, the Duke's chamber. So it kind of like it comes together in that yeah maybe the Duke was I don't know working with Aldia or something, and then Seath's soul was like attached to this spider that grew and grew and grew or whatever into Freya. So I do like that the Duke's chambers are like attached to his beloved Freya's
Right.
giant spider den. I think this is it's close. It's either this or the Lost Sinner for my favorite of the four. I really do enjoy the Freya fight, even though it isn't. Again, it's that's the one kind of residing or resounding trait for all of these boss fights in DS2 is like none of them are that difficult ultimately, but they
Right.
have unique qualities that make them fun. And I kind of like the trying to balance the gankiness of all the little Freya's spiders with attacking either side of Freya. I don't know. I've always found this kind of like cat and mouse chasing and moving around. It's kind of like Rom. I mean, they're both spider bosses. It's an easy comparison to make, but you're bobbing and weaving to try to hit a target essentially for
Yeah.
both of those fights. And I think this is I actually prefer Freya to Rom in that regard. Like I think there's a little bit more. Freya has a bit more dynamic move set compared to Rom. She has more attacks. Like it does feel like you're fighting Freya, whereas Rom it feels like Rom's kind of rolling around, whereas Freya's like actually engaged in the fight. So it feels like you're fighting Freya, and you're also like, oh, I have to maybe pick off a couple of these spiders, or roll around, dodge to pop a life gem or something like that. So I've always enjoyed this fight.
Yeah, same. I think it's definitely my favorite of the four. And yeah, it feels to me like maybe in Demon Souls, the armor spider, they weren't really sure how to make a boss fight work, like a three-dimensional
Hmm.
boss fight with a huge, enemy AI like that. So the armor spider, it's a good gimmick because you're just in this tunnel and you kind of run up to the spider and run back, run up to the spider and run back. This kind of feels like them revisiting that idea, but in a big 3D space where you're fighting a spider from all
Hmm.
sides and kind of like Flexile Sentry. It's like, well, how do we stop them from just getting behind the spider? And it's like, well, we'll make the spider spew like corrosive mist, and the spider will essentially have two heads and like be able to attack from both sides. So it's really cool. I remember the first time I beat this boss, it was with a friend. It was like early on. I just could not do it on my own. And I think we had maybe like a random summon, or I can't recall the NPC summons that might be in this area, but I think there were three of us. And I mean,
Hmm.
again, I had no idea what I was doing. The game was new. I was like terrified. I was terrible at the game. And it just felt like I had this squad and like we took down this giant possessed spider.
Hmm.
It was, yeah, I kind of always harken back to that every time I go back and fight Freya these days. Just yeah, like kind of good memories about this. And I just looked it up out of curiosity because I couldn't remember. The old Pale Drake soul, which you get from the Freya battle in New Game Plus, the flavor text it says almost nothing. But again, Pale Drake, it's got to be Seath. It says, Soul of the Ineffable, this once magnificent soul continues to exert influence over the land even after the eons have reduced it to these remnants used to acquire blah blah blah. So that doesn't say much, but the weapon that you can trade it in for is the Moonlight Greatsword. So I think this
Yeah.
is, this is clearly that's the connection. It's Seath. Which then also gets me thinking, the four kings aren't represented, but the four kings were almost like they didn't possess a great soul in the way that Seath or Gwyn did. They were kind of like a different case, and I feel like you even see that in like DS3. Like they're just kind of, the four kings are almost like lost to history a little bit throughout these games.
Hmm. Right. Yeah,
But
they're not alluded too much beyond DS1. Like I don't. Yeah, there's not a this kind of like continuous connection from the Four Kings onwards.
no. But I feel like the most important part of this, now that we're starting to approach late game, when we activate the primal bonfire just beyond Freya's arena, we meet Aldia for the first time, assuming we're playing Scholar. He literally just explodes out of the fire and starts interrogating us. Like it's actually pretty hysterical when you think about it. And right, like I was saying in the beginning, starts asking you these big questions. What does it mean to be a king and the yoke of fate and all this stuff? Which, yeah, on the surface, it's kind of like, what the hell is this? What is this thing? And why is it asking me all these questions? But I do think the more that you, or maybe rather the less you resist this kind of strange journey DS2 is taking you on, and the more you start to realize like it's sort of less about the world and the players in it and the players who are in DS1, and it's more about you and what are you going to do and what kind of world do you want to be part of. And if you become, Vendrick's successor, how are you going to shape the kingdom? And are you going to link the flame? Are you going to let it fade? Are you going to search for this third way? So it is interesting, but yeah, it's super jarring though the first time that he just pops out of the bonfire and starts yelling at you. Finally have all the souls and the power we need. The Shrine of Winter back in the Shaded Woods allows us to gain entry to Drangleic Castle, where the Emerald Herald is waiting for us. I have her dialogue right here. She says, "This castle is isolated, but nonetheless, you must forge on and bring an end to your journey and mine." So, yeah, I mean, this is, we make our way up, we fight through a really tough level. This castle always felt like an homage to like the Tower of Sauron or maybe like Ganon's castle from Ocarina of Time to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, lot to talk about at the end of this level, but any thoughts just on like this progression itself and like getting to this level and the actual level design of the castle?
Yeah, the run up just feels so epic, for lack of a better word, especially with the Emerald Herald showing up. It just feels like such a significant moment that your firekeeper, the person that you keep returning to or have been returning to throughout your journey, is now here with you. Yeah, like out in the wild. You're like, wait, you're not back at home. Like something big is about to happen for you to be here with me now. So I always thought that was really cool that Emerald Herald shows up right before we make our way into the castle itself. So, and then yeah, the big walk up leading up to the castle, like you were saying, Ganon's castle. You're there. You finally have made it to the place that you've been told about and have been trying to get to this entire time. And you've got the two, I forget what they're called, the big like mammoth.
Yeah, they're like mastodons or yeah, I think they're called primal
Mhm.
knights maybe, or I think the game guide might call
Mhm.
them primal knights, but yeah,
Mhm.
because there's one in Doors of Pharos, but then the two that
Mhm.
are standing outside of Drangleic Castle, and then like again needing to it's sort of an environmental puzzle you almost stumble on the first time, but needing to kill enemies so that the golems can siphon their souls and open the gates. You
Yep.
just
Mhm.
right off the bat, you're like, oh, this is for real. Like this is not a joke. And I
Mhm.
I remember, the first time I sort of assumed like this could be the end of the game because DS2 is it's a pretty long
Mhm.
game. There's a lot of content in DS2 for
Mhm.
better or worse. And yeah, coming up to this castle, I assumed like, well, this just might be it. Final
Mhm.
boss is probably at the top of the castle.
Yeah, it definitely gives that vibe. I mean, it turns out there's a fair chunk left to this game, past the castle. But yeah, it definitely, it felt like the turning point where like, yeah, now I'm into the late game. Like I feel like
Yeah,
I'm about to accomplish what I set out to accomplish.
totally. We fight our way up and we meet Nashandra before a room where we fight a pair of dragon riders. And I have her text here too. She says, "You have fought admirably on your journey. cursed undead. I am Nashandra, Queen of Drangleic, a true monarch, carries the weight of their souls. The last king of this land, King Vendrick, as he was called, he was less of a king than you might imagine. He found the strength to rule his people, and when the undead were born cursed, he found more strength to face them. But in the end, he never took the true throne. Visit Vendrick. We have no need for two rulers. So at this point, I mean, she seems pretty sketchy. She seems pretty creepy, but you don't really understand at this point that, oh, she's just playing you. Like Vendrick sort of exhausted his usefulness, and now she's hoping, you'll give her access to the throne in the first flame, because she knows that, he's gone. So yeah, I don't know, just kind of an interesting moment. And again, to me, and originally I was thinking like, well, this is the end of the game. This is the queen. I don't know, Vendrick must be behind this door. Let's go. This is the, credits are coming or something. I just had no idea what to expect. It's actually just two bosses, a boss you fought earlier, but two of them. Yeah.
Yeah, the twin dragon riders. Actually, it's kind of
it's a good puzzle though, isn't
boss.
it? One up high with a bow and one on the ground. I actually don't mind it.
Yeah, I can't hate on this boss too much because it is.
No, it's cool.
Fun. Every time
in like a room,
I like it.
Yeah, in like maybe in a room of Nashandra and Vendrick's treasure, treasure that now has no real value. Just kind of an interesting little arena, like a treasure room. At the top of Drangleic Castle, we don't meet Vendrick, which I think everybody expects, but we do meet one of the game's best bosses, the Looking Glass Knight, one of Vendrick's lieutenants, kind of like Velstadt, still standing guard with his barbed sword and shield that can channel warriors from other dimensions, meaning other players, sort of like the old monk boss fight from Demon Souls. Talk to me about this boss, because I know you're a big fan too.
Just so cool. Like just to begin with the setting, being at the top of the castle, and if I recall, it's like kind of stormy, or it just feels very like dark and like overcast, and in some senses it does feel like this could have been like the setting for the final boss a little bit. And yeah, the Looking Glass Knight is just top to bottom, just perfect design. Like this feels like maybe the most Dark Souls boss in this game. Like if we're just looking back at like DS1, DS3, like this, like looking at Dark Souls 2 bosses, Looking Glass Knight stands out just from all design standpoints. I think if I were to, I don't know, have a criticism, it might be some of the attack patterns feel a little jank, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've fought the Looking Glass Knight. I haven't hit this point yet in my current playthrough, but yeah, huge fan.
Yeah, I want to say when we did that boss tier stream on your Twitch channel, I'm pretty sure this was an automatic S. Again, like within, the confines of DS2. Yeah, this is definitely one of the best battles, from music to arena to boss design. Yeah, it almost feels like you could imagine like a slightly faster version of this boss in like DS3 or something. But yeah, really, really cool fight. I guess intentionally anticlimactic though, where it's like, okay, this isn't Vendrick. This is like one of Vendrick's lieutenants. You slay him, and then you have an elevator, which you ride, from way up on top on this like, now iconic castle, like definitely one of the most iconic castles in the series. And you ride way, way down below the castle now to another one of your favorite levels, the Shrine of Amana.
Well, I'm going to tap out for this one too, Tara. I'm just going to take a quick little break, and I'll let you tackle this one.
Well, I do have some thoughts for sure. So I'll say, I want to give you your safe space to vent. I do want to do that. I will say, visually, it's stunning. That's the one thing that I'll give Shrine of Amana over Iron Keep, whereas I feel Iron Keep is like painfully generic. Shrine of Amana is just visually stunning. I mean, again, even playing it 10 years later, it's like, wow, this is really cool. I mean, the atmosphere, the colors, that Milfinito song, which, the Milfinito, they're really interesting. And there's quite a bit of ambiguity there too. It's implied that Nito, their name sounds a little bit like Nito. It's implied that he created them. He taught them their song, which is meant to comfort the undead. But then it also seems like this shrine, I mean, again, you can speculate like what was the original purpose of this shrine? Why is it here? Why is it below the castle? it seems to have become like a prison of sorts to contain the Demon of Song, whose origins are also pretty unclear because the Demon of Song isn't really a demon in the way that like the Stray Demon is a demon. So, but it can mimic the Milfinito's song and like lure in prey, which is pretty horrifying and like clearly killed or nearly killed that Milfinito you find right outside of its fall gate. But yeah, I think most players, despite all of this, they actually won't remember Demon of Song, which I think is a pretty interesting boss. They won't remember the sort of art direction down here. They'll just remember the snipers, the mobs. It is pretty oppressive is the word that comes to mind. Like it's oppressive.
My notes just say in all caps, ha 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 ha, WTF, I hate this place. And then for Demon of Song, it just says in all caps, ha 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 ha, WTF, I love this frog. So those are my show notes for Shrine of Amana and Demon of Song. Because yeah, the priestess NPCs are just, or the priestess enemies are just so oppressive, and it just makes traversing this level, as pretty as it is, like you said, it's a very like, you make your way out of the lift and you kind of go down into this like beautiful kind of crystal cavern, but it doesn't matter. That doesn't matter at all because these priestesses are there to ruin your day from start to finish. It just makes the run up to Demon of Song rough enough to where, yeah, I don't really, I like Demon of Song. It's a really crazy design. I mean, having a skull coming out of a frog is hilarious and cool and very Miyazaki, and like I love everything about that. But the run up through Shrine of Amana, dealing with the priestesses, firing the most magic spells I think I've ever seen from soft game repeatedly. It's
Yeah, I
unfortunate.
mean,
It just
to
totally
me,
distracts.
it actually feels like the level design was probably on paper a good idea because it feels a
Hmm.
little bit, I think we talked about this before, it feels a little bit like an Armored Core level to me. Like you have these turrets on you and you're trying to navigate a
Hmm.
battlefield, a little bit like Jura in Yarnum in Bloodborne, or a little bit like the Lightning Caster in Sekiro in oh my gosh, what is it? The beautiful palace level. Why can I not think of it?
Oh yeah, oh, that's gonna bother me. But yeah, where it's just a big lake, and it's like all these beautiful buildings that lead up to what looks like this like cliff, and then there's the guy who's like shooting this electric soccer ball, like firing that down at you.
Yes, and this is just one of those annoying things where I have to look it up really quick or we won't be able to proceed. Fountainhead Palace. Okay, Fountainhead. I don't know why
Fountainhead
that happens.
Palace.
I feel like every time we do one of these, there's like one to two things that neither of us can recall
Yeah.
for some reason.
Hey, there's just so many areas, so many enemies, so many
Like
bosses
what
that are
percentage of
like
our brains at this
swirling
point are just
around
devoted
in
to
our
like
brain. Yeah,
FromSoft
I know.
encyclopedia crap? Right. But yeah, so it
Too great of a percentage at this point.
so yeah, it feels a little bit like that to me, but then it's like, okay, but maybe have like fewer clerics, have a couple fewer lizard men. Like it's just they're too heavy-handed with it. You could have
Mhm.
subtracted probably like 30% of the enemies and it would have just been a better experience. And then even like those like clerics that are down there, I find that to be kind of a weird detail too, because they're apparently from Lindelt, which is this other
Mm.
place that we don't know a whole lot about. These like arch drake clerics, and all we
Mm.
know is I think flavor text says they made their way to Drangleic to like start new lives, but they went hollow,
Mm.
and now they're just like out for blood. And it's like, but why? How did they get down here? Like, what's I don't know. And like you said, Demon of Song, such a cool design. I love when they go into weird territory like this. But yeah, it kind of takes away from the boss a little bit, just how oppressive the level is leading up to it. Oh, another weird detail. I'm just looking at some notes I have here. You can find Vendrick's crown down here. It's behind that
Oh
locked
yeah,
door.
yeah.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
I don't know if it's like maybe when he was making this kind of final trip down to Undead Crypt, maybe he just discarded his crown in the shrine. So yeah, there's connections in this place to like Lindelt, Vendrick, Nito. There's this strange monster down here. that's preying
Mm,
on people, and it seems to now be like imprisoned to a degree. It's just a really strange place, and I don't think you can certainly speculate, but like the game doesn't really give us a lot of clear direction on like what the deal is with Shrine of Amana.
mhm,
It's sort of like the foyer, the undead crypt. It's kind of a funny way to think about it. So we meet Aldia again when we get to Undead Crypt. He explodes out of the
mhm,
bonfire and asks us some kind of weird questions.
mhm,
Agdane, who is sort of like the crypt keeper down there, I think he's pretty cool. He's one of the more memorable NPCs. He has a lot of interesting dialogue, and boy, he gets your attention right away, telling you, like, you there, do not light your torch. Like, don't do it, which obviously makes
mhm.
you want to do it. And we've all done it and seen what happens. But if you listen to him and don't introduce any light to the area and go talk to him, he's a merchant. He's got some cool dialogue. So thoughts on kind of the transition from Shrine of Amana to Undead Crypt?
It's definitely it feels like the right kind of tonal shift, right? Where
Hmm.
Shrine of Amana is like this weird, yeah, kind of like what you were getting at, where there's just so many factors and it just seems so uncertain. To go from that in this kind of beautiful, crystalline underground river type vibe to this crypt, and then yeah, having Agdane just be just super straight up with you and very serious. The tone shifts in it like puts you in the right headspace to then eventually make your way to Velstad, which is again another top 5 boss for me. So I like the shift in tone from the shrine into the crypt. Feels like it's we're starting to move forward. We're starting to pick up a little bit, and we got to really kind of focus in here moving forward.
For sure, I agree. Whereas Shrine of Amana is a little all over the place, the crypt feels a lot more focused. Yeah, I feel like the bells, like how you don't want the bells to be rung. Either you do it accidentally or an enemy does it. The rocks you have to break through, the knights creating that wall and that tunnel with their big shields. It's a clever
Mm,
level. It's not my favorite, but it's not a bad level. And then at the end, Velstadt is waiting for us.
mm,
Another one of the best bosses in the game. I feel like you do get a couple bangers here with Looking Glass Knight, Demon of Song, and Velstadt. These are some of the best bosses in the game.
mm,
Velstadt, I feel like he's so iconic now. His melee weapon is so awesome. And then yeah, finally the big reveal after him. I mean, at this point you start kind of putting things together, like who's probably on the
mm,
other side of Velstadt. And I think you mentioned this earlier, but when you finally see Vendrick, it is pretty shocking because,
mm,
yeah, he's just this hollowed zombie dragging his sword around, does not aggro on you. You can fight him here, but he has so much defense that it's almost pointless
mm,
because you can actually lower that defense by obtaining giant souls later, which that's an interesting connection that someone who carries giant souls can weaken
mm,
Vendrick. But the big prize down here with Vendrick, because you see Vendrick's clothing, his human clothing on the backside of that chamber. The big prize is his ring, the king's ring, and it
mm,
says, I think this is Emerald Herald. Yeah, this ring is the symbol of the king. Use it to gain passage through the king's gate and venture to the far east. Bearer of the curse, if you are to be the next monarch, then one day you will walk those grounds without really knowing why. So yeah, before we kind of get on to your final tasks here now that you have the King's Ring. Any thoughts on Velstadt, Vendrick, just kind of what's going on here?
Yeah, I think, kind of going back to what I was just saying about the tone shifting, that moment when you first see Vendrick in this zombie-like state, it kind of starts putting things in perspective. Like you were saying, things are kind of starting to like come together in your mind, and you start to like question like, I talked to Nashandra earlier. She mentioned I would meet with the king. Why is he down here? Why is he in the crypt? Why does he look this way? Why is he acting this way? So you're kind of your quest becomes reinvigorated a little bit. You're like, okay, well, yeah, now I have to go east. Now that I've got this ring, I have to keep it moving. And then yeah, we end up in Aldia's Keep. I think that's the next place where we are kind of pushed to go after this. Yeah, very very haunting encounter with Vendrick.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a little like Gwyn, that realization when you find Gwyn in the kiln at the end of DS1, where he is just this hollowed out shell. And it's like, whoa, this is Gwyn. This is the guy I've heard so much about. You have that moment with Vendrick too. And I feel like that boss battle, it's almost odd to call it a boss battle. It is. But I do think it's a pretty clever one where, even if you're kind of OP, I mean, he can 2, 3 shot you and, you can just sort of learn the attack patterns and take him down. But I remember just being so perplexed by this the first time I played the game. And I think to this day, it's like a really kind of unique encounter. Yeah, to your point about the King's Ring, kind of like where we get pushed. Yeah, there's two main highlights, I feel like, from the King's Ring. One is that it opens an otherwise locked door in the Cardinal Tower. The place unbeknownst is the name of that bonfire. And this allows us to access one of the many giant trees scattered throughout the level. This one is the memory, I think it's the memory of Jay, because we know that the giants turn into trees after they die. But even though we can open that door with the King's Ring, we don't have any way to interact with the tree yet. So that leads us to our other destination, as you said, Aldia's Keep. And that's I think where the Emerald Herald, she says, like, go to the east. Because again, there's this sense that like we're, Drangleic is like kind of this big sprawling kingdom and we're just kind of bopping all over the place. So now it's Aldia's Keep. We saw Vendrick, we've been to his castle, and now we're going to Aldia's Keep. We've heard so much about him. We've talked to him a little bit at this point. We get to reach his keep. We also touched on Lucatiel's quest earlier, ending here. I feel like the keep, I don't know, it's a pretty interesting level. It's essentially the penultimate level of the game, the base game. The hallway section feels pretty. That's what I always think of. I don't think as much about the big chamber with the skeleton dragon skeleton. I mostly think of that hallway with all the caged creatures. That feels pretty kind of Bloodborne-y to me. And there's
Bloodborne.
Yeah, like lots of monsters and mad scientists. Like Aldia's acolytes are still in the keep doing stuff. I think I mentioned this earlier, but there's that one room full of giant corpses. You can just see what Aldia and by extension Vendrick justified doing in order to break out of this fire dark cycle. That they were just, yeah, I mean, Aldia's Keep is basically just a mad laboratory. Do you enjoy this level?
Yeah, I love Aldia's Keep, and it's because it makes me think of our conversation when we were first talking about our first experiences with Elden Ring. And one of the things that stood out to me at the time was it felt like progressing through the world of Elden Ring, it felt lived in, and it felt like, we were living through a time in the history of that world. Whereas in previous games, we're fighting the enemies of like a forgotten time, or like we have to take down these bosses who are like past their time, right? Like in Dark Souls 3, you've got, Aldrich is a great example of that, where he's kind of at the end of, like, and Orlando is a shell of what it once was, right? Whereas in Elden Ring, there are a lot of like dungeons and stuff that felt like, oh, there are still things happening here. And Aldia's Keep is maybe like kind of the perfect example of that in Dark Souls 2, where it feels like there are still things, like it's still active. Like there are these weird experiments going on, and it does feel, yeah, as that Bloodborne mad scientist vibe. Like it feels alive, and that there are things, these crazy, creepy things going on in Aldia's Keep. So I'm always excited to end up here at this point in any playthrough, because it's just, yeah, it's exciting. It's like a bit more invigorating than other points in the map.
And yeah, I think the design is pretty interesting. There's the enemies that come out of the mirrors on the walls. That dragon skeleton can actually activate and kill you. There's also Navlon trapped here, which is the split personality wizard who, sends you out on assassination quests that you can perform or fake for him. You can bring him trinkets to lead, him to believe that you've killed the people he wants you to kill. And he has a lot of amazing spells and sets you can get. And then, yeah, that really memorable hallway, you can bait the ogres to like break through walls, and certain doors are locked, and there's some really tough enemies, and, the acolytes hiding behind paintings. I think it's a great level. And yeah, this place in general, I feel like the Healing Church would have approved of Aldia's Keep. They would have been into what's going down at this place. We end up at the end of the keep battling the Guardian Dragon, a dragon I would assume Aldia and his goons like captured in that almost like oversized bird cage, probably to study for experiments, because we know Aldia was obsessed with dragons. And then beyond that, we take a lift way up to Dragoniri, which is sort of like the highest point in Drangleic. And yeah, I think given Aldia's obsession with dragons, probably makes sense that he built his keep at the base of a place like this. And yeah, I think that's one of the like whereas the elevator from Earthen Peak to Iron Keep is like, what the hell? I think this elevator is one of the better reveals in this game. Like that's a pretty exciting moment. And there's even those holes in this sort of silo, this rock silo that you're going up where you can kind of see through and you can
Hmm.
see dragons zipping by and you're like up in the clouds and it's just like, oh man, like where am I going? What's happening? And when you step out, it's pretty stunning. It almost like invokes this sense that this is like what the world was once like, just dragons and stone.
Yeah, I love that moment of reaching the top of the lift and boom, you're in this like huge mountainous region where there's just dragons flying all around you. And then you get to traverse through across these big ravines via bridges and you get to deal with all these little dragons.
Zip
I
lines?
think yeah, the zip lines too. I think it's visually really cool, and I think running around it feels. I think it feels good the first time running through this level. I did feel, I think with subsequent playthroughs that it's a bit. Um,
You just
I
want to
don't know.
dash
It's
through
it's
it, don't you?
yeah, a little bit, a little
Yeah.
bit. Like I love visually. It's super cool. But it's like I just got to get to the shrine a little bit
Right, right,
on
right, right.
subsequent playthroughs. But it is fun to explore the first time through for sure.
Well, and then the Emerald Herald is again creepily waiting for us and basically reveals that she's
Mhm.
always been here. Not in Majula,
Mhm.
not at Drangleic Castle, that those were like illusions or ghosts or something of her. Yeah, I have her dialogue here. She says, "Bearer of the curse, long have I awaited one such as you, one who might shatter the shackles of fate, one who can set me free. It was my own manifestation that led you here. The ancient
Mhm.
dragon has watched over the world for aeons past. Take this, do not resist. The dragon welcomes you." And she gives us the feather, which is a sort of a permanent homeward bone. Yeah, I think that again kind of reinforces she's probably a just another one of Aldia's failed experiments. And that's she's probably been up here chilling with the dragons this
Mhm.
whole time because she's apparently like half human, half dragon. And then when we get to the shrine, Aldia shows up too. He says his name real loudly. He says some philosophical stuff, and we
Mhm.
battle our way, maybe or maybe not up to the dragon. Because again,
Mhm.
I think we're led to believe this is not a real dragon, but I always liked how through the shrine, if you take out those big Drake keepers, the smaller dragon knights will bow and not aggro at you. I didn't learn that until like
Mhm.
years after the game came out. I just again was
Mhm.
assuming to kill everybody. And this place is just so
Mhm.
overwhelming if all those knights come at you, especially the ones on that big sort of Anor Londo style staircase. But
Yep.
yeah, it's kind of cool how you can sort of earn their respect by taking out the biggest, baddest
Mhm.
knights. And it's like my understanding that these knights are part of almost like some fringe band of warriors obsessed with dragons. Like, I don't know if they're like
Mhm.
had ties to Aldia or Vendrick or not, or they're almost just this like forgotten group up in the clouds. It's not really clear. Yeah, any thoughts on this level before we get to the Ancient Dragon?
Um, Nothing too crazy. I do love the design of the Dragon Knights and the Drake Keepers that you mentioned. I think I always that's the big memorable thing for me is just fighting them. I there are a lot of enemies throughout DS2 that I think might be a little bit forgettable or easily forgotten, but both the Drake Keepers and Dragon Knights are definitely definitely a huge part of the draw to Dragon Shrine.
Yeah, they provide a good kind of final combat training session if you need it. But when we finally reach the dragon, who again is probably not actually a dragon, who's probably an Aldia creation like the Emerald Herald, some kind of illusion or something. But like the Emerald Herald, has a pretty memorable passage of sort of like telepathic dialogue with us. It's the murk shifts and stirs, yet another stands before us, then so be it. For the curse of life is the curse of want. And so you peer into the fog in hope of answers. Yeah, we get the Ashen Mist Heart. I remember back in the day when this game first came out, I thought this was the end. Like, I genuinely thought, like,
Mm,
okay, I'm at the top of the world with this gigantic dragon. I got the special item. All right, this is it. I win. I had no idea that I was
Mhm.
supposed to like go back and access the giant tree memories and then go back to the castle, down to the throne chamber. That's what you're supposed to do at this point. It's a little bit of
Mhm.
a wild goose chase. And again, I don't think
Mhm.
the game makes it probably as clear as it should be where you need to go and what you need to do. Yeah, you can obviously fight the ancient dragon, which is, you know, when the game came out, I didn't get it. It was like I just kept getting killed and killed and killed. It was like this is impossible. And over time, you kind of realize
Mhm.
you can just bait the dragon repeatedly, like bait the fire breath, run up, clip its toenails, run back out, bait the fire breath, run back in, clip the toenails. There's not actually a lot to it, but yeah, it's not the end of the game. And I feel like this is kind of the
Mhm.
second time DS2 does this. We talked about it at the top of Drangleic Castle with the Mirror Knight, where it's like, okay, this isn't it, I guess. And then you kind of go back down into the depths. And I feel like that happens again here, where it's like, okay, I'm at the top of the world with the ancient dragon, yet this isn't it.
Yeah, it jukes you a little bit because, yeah, it's and then the other thing about the both the Dragon Area and the Dragon Shrine is you're constantly like ascending through the level, so it feels like just physically you're working your way to the very top, and as you said, you're at the pinnacle, you're at the top of this giant dragon shrine with a huge dragon. Like this is like where else can I go from here? A little bit. And yeah, it's not, and yeah, it's not super clear what you need to do after this necessarily. So I can only imagine when DS2 dropped, having to try to piece all of this together.
Yeah.
Fortunately, when I played through this, I was, for the most part, I tried to do it without a guide. In instances like this, it's like, well, now what? Like, what's next? Yeah, it can be a little bit hard to piece everything together in this game, but for the most part, I think it's intuitive enough to navigate through the general progression of
Right.
DS2.
So, of all the the giant trees and memories, the only mandatory one is that memory of Jay, where you fight
Yep.
the giant lord. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's the final progression now. It's to access memories via the giant trees, go back to the castle, past the Locked King's Gate,
Mhm.
and down to the throne chamber. So as we know, though, the throne itself is blocked off by that chasm with the golems. And again, like you were saying back
Mhm.
in the day, I mean, I was playing through this game with a friend who was like at this point of that, like he had played Demon Souls. He introduced me to DS1. So he was almost like my human wiki during this. He was figuring stuff out and then telling me what to do. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I, go and do it.
Mhm.
So yeah, I remember him telling me like to go to this specific tree, the one that you get access to with the King's Ring. And yeah, you fight the Giant Lord, the leader of the Giants when they stage their counterattack on Drangleic. I kind of read this as like Jay is the name of the warrior who slayed the Giant Lord, like as with the other, or, because I don't think you're like going back and you're obviously not like reliving the actions of a giant. You're going
Mhm.
back and slaying the Giant Lord. So, as with the other memories, I kind of feel like you're experiencing them through the eyes of like a specific soldier. But I've also heard people speculate you're more time traveling as yourself, almost like butterfly effect, like going back in time, doing something. So then it's the case in the future. I don't know. It's pretty unclear. I feel
Mhm.
like there's room for personal interpretation here. But the Giant Lord boss battle, I feel like is kind of forgettable because honestly, I feel like the fire bombs and the rolling head statue are probably
Yeah.
like more dangerous, than the giant lord himself. Again, you clip his
Mhm.
toenails and it's over.
Mhm.
But you get the giant's kinship, the last piece of the puzzle in terms of accessing the throne of want. So now, in this wild goose chase again, that's one kind of critique I have of the end game here is there's not much flow after Dragon Eerie. You're kind of just warping
Mhm.
around. I did realize we haven't shouted out Benhart, which the giant memory
Oh my
you
gosh.
think of.
What if we need to start over. We need to
I
start
know,
over
right?
from the
Kind of the
top.
onion knight
He's
of
like
this game.
he's
Yeah.
the first NPC you meet coming out of things betwixt
Yeah.
in Majula.
And you see
He's
the sword.
chilling
The
by
sword catches your eye right away.
immediately. You see this cool looking Viking lord looking guy with a giant great sword just hanging out, just sitting. And yeah, it turns out he's like your best friend for the rest of the game. If you want to you want an NPC summon, Ben Hart is your guy by far.
Well, and I also like this idea that on one hand, FromSoft is playing with your expectations a little bit because, this is a legacy weapon now that's been appearing in their game in some version or another for years. So when you see someone with what appears to be the Moonlight Greatsword,
Hmm.
like right outside of the hub area, it's like, whoa. But it turns out, and he's very proud of the sword, right? He talks about it like it's this family heirloom and it's this great weapon. But I love this idea actually that it's like a false sword. It's the Blue Moon Greatsword. It
Hmm.
is not.
Yeah.
It is not the real deal, which we talked about earlier. You actually can get that weapon by transposing the old Pildrake soul you get in New Game Plus from fighting Freya, if that's not
Mm.
confusing enough. It almost like, I feel like it hints at this idea of like historical inaccuracies, like all these kingdoms have come and gone, and there probably was some notion in Drangleic of like this legendary shining moon sword. And Ben Hart and his family just assume like, oh yeah, we have it. And it's like, no, 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 you don't have it. You have like a cheap knockoff. But it is, it's the same with like the old Dragonslayer in Hyde's Tower of Flame. Like that's not Ornstein. I think that's someone, high on the legacy of Ornstein, like almost cosplay. So I
Mhm.
don't know, it's just kind of an interesting thing that DS2 does that I feel like a game like DS1 just can't as much, being the first game.
Yeah, it just really it is fascinating that it's the Blue Moon Greatsword. It makes you think about some of those kind of in game the bits of lore that aren't like touched on in the flavor text or at all ever, but it's like, oh, maybe who is the blacksmith that made Ben Hart's
Blue
Blue
Moon.
Moon
Yeah.
Greatsword? You know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
Like it's one of those cool little details. Because yeah, it very well could have just been like, oh yeah, Ben Hart's wielding the Moonlight Greatsword. Like they could have done that. That would have
Yeah.
been the easy thing. But no, it's just like a cool little flavorful detail that no, Ben Hart's got his own rendition on the Moonlight. It's called the Blue Moon.
Yeah. Well, and again, if you do his quest, which I think ends in the memory of Oro, but if you follow his quest through, he gives you his gear eventually, which is like, okay, thanks. You can summon him for a lot of key boss battles, like Looking Glass Knight,
Mhm.
the Giant Lord. He is in the memory of Jay, and then obviously the endgame bosses too. So
Mhm.
yeah, he is kind of like you were saying. He's down. He is down to cross swords with your enemies with you. So that's yeah, that's pretty cool. But take out the Giant's Lord, you get this Giant's kinship item, the last piece in your puzzle. You use the King's Ring, descend below Drangleic Castle, because again, you're kind of undoing this puzzle that Vendrick set up before he hollowed to stop Nashandra. You're pretty much undoing it. And up until this point, I mean, you undoing it could be nefarious, it could be
Mhm.
noble, it could be, I mean, again, it's all up to you. That's the whole point of the game. So you descend below Drangleic Castle, and there's the Emerald Herald again. She's pretty creepy at this point, just popping up and saying cryptic stuff. But she says, I got her text here. She says, my journey is complete. My name is Shanalotte. The dragon gave me this name, for I was born with none. I was born of dragons contrived by men, by ones who had chosen fate herself. They are the ones who created me, but they failed. I did not come out as intended. Fate would not be bested, and men were cursed once again. If you proceed, Nashandra will come after you. Knowing that you will take the throne and link the fire, she covets the first flame in the great soul. Put Nashandra to rest. So, if it wasn't clear already, it's very, very clear now that you're about to get access in some way to the first flame in the throne, this sort of both literal and sort of metaphorical, symbolic throne. And Nashandra has probably been using you, and she's probably
Mhm.
going to try to seize this opportunity. So you head down into the throne chamber and you deal with Throne Watcher and Defender, which I don't know, is there much to say about that fight?
Nothing too crazy, with any sort of kind of boss fight with two powerful bosses at the end of a game. We have to point back towards Ornstein and Smo. And I don't know, this doesn't necessarily reach that caliber in my mind, but I do like their designs for like the armor. I like the split in move sets and kind of splits in aggro versus more defensive strategies. So they both play a little bit different, but in general, they're far less interesting of a fight when compared to the likes of Ornstein and Smo.
Yeah, agreed. I'm right there with you. Really cool armor sets, but I don't know, not the most dynamic battle, but yeah, I mean they reinforce this idea. They're guarding the throne. They were put here by Vendrick, and after you take them out, Nashandra in her true form shows up. And assuming you've already taken down Vendrick, Aldia shows up after her, which it is sort of an odd way to end a game with three consecutive boss battles, none of which are great, in my opinion. I guess in Scholar with Aldia, they're trying to put more of a bow on things. I'm not sure why he chooses to fight you here. I guess it's one last test of your mettle, and I, I don't think the community was super thrilled with Nashandra being sort of the final note in this game. So maybe it was like, okay, you didn't like her. How about him? But he's not that much better, at least in my opinion. He just kind of teleports around and shoots fire at you. He's kind of just a big
Yeah.
blob. Thoughts on Nashandra and Vendrick here, or Aldia here?
Yeah, also a little lackluster in comparison to other final bosses in FromSoft games, but yeah, I mean Nashandra feels like a final boss at least. Like she exudes that kind of final boss energy. She's at this point, the Emerald Herald basically tells you that she's the antagonist at this point. She wants to take the flame. She wants to take the throne. So she needs to be dealt with. So in that regard, Nashandra feels like a final boss. I think she looks cool too. But yeah, not exactly an exciting fight itself. And I think maybe that plays a little bit too in that it is a little slower pace. It is a little, at times it does feel kind of turn based, like I was saying. But with Nashandra, as long as you can bridge the gap and get close to her, there's not a lot you have to worry about in this fight.
Yeah,
So
the curse fountains are her main, like kind of her
yeah.
most dangerous move. But yeah, to your point about like that turn-based vibe, she's pretty stationary. She kind of feels like a
Mm.
turret or a tower to me with a defense around her. The curse fountains, versus Gale, or sorry, not Gale. Well, I mean, yes, with Gale, but I was meant to say Gwyn, where Gwyn's kind of all over the place, swinging at you. You're trying to evade him. Nishandra is just a very different pace, probably a pace that more fitting to the system of DS2. With Aldia, he again pops up as he always does. You never see Aldia coming from like a mile away, right? Just slowly kind of like slithering toward you. He's always just boom, I'm here, I'm Aldia. And when you defeat him, he says, I lost everything but remained here patiently. The throne will certainly receive you. But the question remains, what do you want truly? Light, dark, or something else entirely? So it is kind of interesting because I feel like with him, his brother Vendrick, and then Vendrick's queen Nashandra, you do see like three different approaches to the cycle. Where Gwyn was kind of just like, hey, I'm the Lord of Light. I'm not into the dark humanity. None of this. I'm keeping this fire going. This is my world. You're all just living in it. With Vendrick, you kind of get like the analysis paralysis. Like I don't think Vendrick liked either of his options. Where he sort of saw Nashandra, she just wanted the flame. She just wanted power, and he didn't like that. But then he saw his brother, who was really he had like no moral boundaries. He was willing to do anything and experiment in any kind of way to find an alternative. He's almost like maybe has that in common with Aldrich a little bit, like pretty morally
Mm.
bankrupt. I mean, I don't know that anybody is quite as vile as like Aldrich, but um, yeah, I
Mm.
mean, Vendrick just ultimately in the end didn't make much of a decision. He just tried to stop
Mm.
the two people closest to him who he disagreed with. He protected the throne from Nashandra and he sealed off Aldia, presumably in his keep. So yeah, it's I don't know, it's interesting. And then at this point, assuming you've taken out Throne Watcher and Defender, Nashandra, and Aldia, you can either walk out of the chamber or use Giant's Kinship to activate the golems and they create a bridge for you to access the throne. In the original game, in vanilla, there was only the throne ending. With stuff like Aldia and Scholar, I think that was probably Tanimura's way of trying to give you that second choice like you had at the end of DS1 and Demon Souls, right? Like to either take action or walk away.
Mm.
And there's been a lot of questions about the actual throne too, because unlike DS1, at the end of this game, there is not, I mean, at the end of DS1, you're literally in the kiln of the first flame with Gwyn, and there's the flame. This is not like that. There's not a flame, but there's a throne, which that feels symbolic. Like DS1 is much more about the
Mm.
flame, DS2 is much more about the throne and like what the throne represents and what kind of all these questions Aldi has been asking you, like what kind of ruler will you be? And Nashandra is almost like dissing Vendrick a little bit when you talk to her at the top of the castle. Like he didn't, a real ruler carries the weight of their souls, and Vendrick never took the real throne. I remember early on, people seriously speculated that the throne room, like that, or that the throne dome, let's call it, had like an elevator in it that lowered you to the flame, presumably after the credits roll, which I always thought was kind of silly. Have two thoughts here. I want to get your reaction to these and hear what you think.
Mhm.
Yeah, one, my first thought is one, like I was saying, DS2 is much more about this idea of what kind of ruler will you be, the player be? Like, what is your outlook on this world? They've chosen to represent those possibilities visually with a throne versus a fire. And the
Mhm.
second thought I have is that DS3 kind of adds new meaning to the Throne of Want at the end of DS2, like given the roles of the thrones in Firelink. Like the idea is that in DS3, the world has atrophied and the fire has gotten so weak and weird that instead of like one person like Gwen just physically or manually kindling the fire, multiple Lords of Cinder sit atop these smoldering thrones, and just that act of sitting on the thrones fortifies the flame. And because all of the lords are sort of off on their own weird agendas in DS3, you kill them and drag their cinders back to the shrine, throw those cinders on the throne, and it works all the same. But I think because of this system in DS3, we can kind of look back at DS2, particularly Scholar, and go, oh, you sitting on the throne is not just like symbolically maybe about linking the fire, but possibly literally too. Like maybe the act of you sitting on
Mhm.
that throne, kind of like the Lords of Cinder in DS3, actually does something to the flame. And that's why you're given the choice to walk away and never, take the throne. But yeah, what is that? I don't know. Does that kind of drum up anything in your mind?
Well, it's interesting because I'm looking at because once you I was thinking back to when you finally link the fire. When you sit on the throne, the Emerald Herald says, once the fire is linked, souls will flourish anew, and all of this will play out again. So, again, alluding to this cycle will continue. And the fact that in this game, in Dark Souls 2 versus Dark Souls 3, I think Vendrick almost stands as a symbol, kind of like in adversely to, like you were saying, the Lords of Cinder. You gather them. Your goal is to gather them, rekindle the flame anew, to then go fight the Soul of Cinder. Whereas in this game, you're dealing with Vendrick, who, like you were saying, kind of failed his mission, and so was trying to like barricade himself in and barricade everyone else out. So rather than in Dark Souls 3 trying to gather and assemble, you're trying to like break through in Dark Souls 2 to continue the cycle again, to rekindle. So it almost feels like chronologically, if DS1, DS2, DS3, DS2's like it really is kind of rekindling that cycle, restarting the cycle before it reaches the point in DS3 when the cycle stagnates once again. If that makes sense.
No, no, I'm tracking with you. And I even feel like them calling it the Throne of Want and Nashandra representing like that desperate part of Manus who longed for power, that all feels pretty pejorative. Like even the term Throne of Want, it almost feels like it casts a negative light on the throne. Again, I think they're leaving this all up to, your interpretation, but it does feel like walking away, maybe slightly, is like the more noble, maybe like the more noble path here. And I think that's why they added it in Scholar and added the Aldia fight in his extra dialogue, because you mentioned there's the Emerald Herald's dialogue. If you do take the throne, if you walk out, which that's what I did in my recent playthrough, you hear Aldia say, there is no path beyond the scope of light, beyond the reach of dark. What could possibly await us? Yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate. That's the base game. You walk away, and I think we assume by the existence of Dark Souls 3 that whether you did or somebody else did, the flame continued. I've heard some people even speculate that like the timeline almost makes more sense if it's 1, 3, 2. That's interesting, but I don't buy it just because of like the dreg heap and this idea of like the worlds converging at the end. Like it's very, very clear that DS3 is like the end. Like Miyazaki, when he did press for DS3, he even talked about it as like the apocalypse has basically already happened. So, and you're finding items in DS3 from Drangleic. So in my mind, it is very much 1, 2, 3. But yeah, it does feel like it's subtle, and I think a lot of people weren't anticipating this or maybe didn't catch some of this stuff at the time. I didn't catch a lot of this when I first played through the game, but the more you think about it, I do think DS2 does a really nice job thematically of setting up DS3.
Mm,
It doesn't set up DS3 in the way like here's the characters, here's the timeline, blah blah blah. It's not a sequel in
mhm.
that way. It's a sequel thematically. Again, when you start thinking about Aldrich in the Deep or Lothric refusing to link the flame and just sitting atop his castle with his brother waiting for the end of the world, like all of that has a lot more richness after you've considered all these ideas in DS2, I think, at least.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and maybe this is where I wish people would give DS2 the time of day because it does set the tone for a lot of the themes we do see in Dark Souls 3. And like, I feel like a lot of people, I feel like there's a more direct comparison from DS3 back to DS1, just inherently through, we're back on the OG engine. It feels like we're kind of back in sync. We're kind of touching, returning to our roots a little bit with Dark Souls 3. Obviously, a bit quicker combat pace, but it feels more on brand. It feels like a From game again, a little bit in that regard. But people maybe sell DS2 short a little bit, and just from a narrative and yeah, thematic perspective, there's a lot. Like it's rich. It's rich for world building and rich for setting the stage. What's to eventually come in Dark Souls 3 for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the two games kind of enhance one another. Like you can appreciate three more because of two, and you can actually appreciate two more because
Hmm.
of some of the ideas that are present in three. And yeah, to your point about like going back to the roots, I think also like even though there were co-directors on DS3, like DS3 was ultimately a Miyazaki project. He wasn't the only one directing that game, but it ultimately had his final stamp. And I think especially when you're playing through levels like Lothar Castle, Grand Archives, High Wall, like that all feels real Miyazaki. Like you could like his fingerprints, like when you played his games, you can like sort of detect his fingerprints all over those levels. And it's probably important to remember like DS2 wasn't his vision. Games like Sekiro and Elden Ring and Bloodborne, like those were his vision. DS2 was he had input clearly, but DS2 was the vision of Shibuya and then Tanimura, kind of inheriting some of what
Hmm.
Shibuya did and then coming up with some new stuff, putting new meaning on, old levels and characters and things like we talked about at the beginning. So that's also why it feels kind of different, is that we're used to these Miyazaki driven games. This was not a Miyazaki driven game.
Hmm.
So there's ideas of other directors here more at the forefront. And yeah, it's a very, very different take on Dark Souls. And it will probably always be kind of the stepchild, so to speak, of the trilogy, even like 15, 20 years from now, like people will always be
Uh-huh.
playing the Dark Souls games, right? They're never going to not be part of like gaming. But I'm sure people will
Hmm.
always gravitate more toward one and three just
Hmm.
because, well, just because. And three especially, three will
Hmm.
probably age the best just due to like the gameplay speed and it feels most similar to Elden Ring and things like that. But yeah, it's I think all the more reason just to talk out loud about DS2. And I think even playing through
Hmm.
DS2, you kind of understand like what's going on and what you're doing as you're like progressing through these levels. But I think it's the game that it actually like requires you to talk out loud about it because it is, even though you're like going through the motions playing the game, a lot of this stuff just isn't clear and it's not straightforward and it's not spelled
Hmm.
out. And I think just literally talking about like the sequence of events and what is literally taking place in this game makes it all a lot clearer. So yeah,
Hmm.
that's kind of mostly why I wanted to do this, just to reflect on this game that I've been playing for 10 years that I think today has a pretty strange reputation. And I don't know if the reputation is fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad we spent the last however many hours of our time together. I mean, as always, it's always a pleasure to sit down with you and chat Souls, chat anything from related. So, yeah, I hope, everyone is able to take a little bit of something away from this conversation and just, hop back into Dark Souls 2, fire it up. Why not?
Well,
For
and like
me,
you
like I
said,
was saying,
Leland, there's elements of DS2 in Elden Ring. I feel like there's a lot of DS2 in Elden Ring. So obviously, the team at From still appreciates aspects of this game too, even though, some
Hmm.
things like the enemy respawn limits or even, like capping your HP when you die, kind of Demon Souls style, like to reinforce. I feel like that really like sells hollowing in this game, like how terrible hollowing is. But I also appreciate how, to like a new player, it's like, well, I couldn't handle this level or this boss with full HP, and now you just diminish my HP. Now how am I supposed to do it? And you start stressing about like how many human effigies you have and stuff. So they've clearly dropped certain elements of a game like DS2, but they've kept plenty of ingredients around. And I remember that was the first thing that hit me with the network test, which is crazy to think the Elden Ring network test was in late 2021. But yeah, the first thing being in Limgrave, I was like, oh my God, this looks like Drangleic. Like there's Majula vibes all over this place. So yeah, I think DS2's legacy will continue to live on in From's games in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. Yeah, fired up. If you're listening to us talk about DS2 right now, I highly recommend picking up the controller and actually playing DS2 right now. Because yeah, even though I was, we were joking about me being in pain in the gutter and in Iron Keep earlier, I've been having a blast, honestly, picking this game back up again. And yeah, it's reminding me why it is absolutely worthwhile to tap into this underrated, highly contentious entry into the Soul series.
Yeah, and then to put our last bow on it, I obviously just did, cumulatively, it's probably like 5, 6 hours of Let's
Hmm.
Plays through the three Lost Crown DLCs. Just as part of this most recent playthrough I did, I was like, because I played the base game sort of every single year, but I hadn't done Lost Crowns in a couple years, so I really wanted
Mm.
to replay through
Hmm.
them, and I loved them. I probably enjoyed them more than I ever have this time around, and yeah, I obviously shared a lot of my thoughts while I was playing and talked a lot about, both
Hmm.
the lore and the gameplay. I guess just very quickly, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on Shulva, Broom Tower, and Aleum Lois. These DLCs are interesting because they're not as consequential as like the Bloodborne and even DS1 and then DS3 DLCs. Because Bloodborne and DS1's DLCs, they sort of take you into a version of the past to complete your understanding of the game more. And then DS3's DLCs, they're more future oriented and they actually affect like the fate of the universe, and they're just a little more of
Hmm.
like an extenuate like a extension of the base game. DS2's Lost Crowns aren't really that way at all. I sort of called them half jokingly but half seriously like case studies when I did my Let's Plays, because it feels like that's what they are. You're really, in this world where you're supposed to be contemplating like what kind of ruler are you going to become. You go into these three worlds with these three kings and, sets of kings and queens, and sort of see like what did they do right, what did they do wrong, like what happened here. It almost feels like a lesson from Aldia or something.
Hmm.
But yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the three DLCs.
Yeah, we'll keep it quick. First of all, I have to highly recommend that everyone go check out Tara's playthrough of all three of these DLCs. I watched every minute of all three of them while working, and yeah, super in depth too. Like you weren't sprinting through each level. You were ensuring that you hit or tried to hit pretty much every last detail within each of these DLCs. So yeah, it's an excellent way of experiencing the DLCs and getting like a really in-depth look at yeah, some of the lore, every single boss fight. Terra's obviously he kills it in all the boss fights. So yeah, all around just wanted to shout out what you accomplished with those playthroughs, Terra.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it was.
um
I'm glad you dug them, and yeah, they were fun. They were fun, and it kind of
mhm.
occurred to me. I was like, I don't have like a Souls Let's Play on my channel. I was like, I need one of these, and I was like, well, I'm in the middle of playing DS2. Let's go. Let's do this, and then it's just, it's evergreen content, just there, kind of forever now.
Yeah, so absolutely, we point there for a more in-depth analysis of the DLC. But I guess real quick, if I had to like maybe put them in order, they almost, in some ways, they kind of go in order for me. Like my least favorite being Sunken King. I think The Sin fight's really fun. I know you pointed to it as being one of your favorite dragon fights in all of Souls, but I think Alana falls short a little bit, and I really the kind of gankiness of Shulva. I don't really enjoy the first part of the DLC, despite Sin being a really fun fight. Broom Tower, Old Iron King. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about the area as a whole. I like the verticality of it. It's kind of a little bit too one note for me, maybe. Reskin of Smelter Demon. It's like, I don't know if we really needed that as a DLC boss. But Fume Knight is easily, again, one of the top 5 bosses in DS2. So Fume Knight alone, I think, kind of saves Old Iron King for me a little bit.
Yeah, I feel so mixed on Broom Tower because I think the design, the actual design of the level is amazing. And I think it's better than Shulva. I think it's some of the most impressive level design From has probably produced in the last, 10, 15 years. But yeah, it's just so ganky. And there's a lot of reused assets from Iron Keep, which just, right, that's like PTSD. That's like Souls PTSD. It's like, I don't want any reminders of Iron Keep. I mean, I get it. It was probably convenient for them in terms of the development process. And, those two areas are connected through the Iron King. So it makes sense. I think I give Shulva that edge just because of Sin and just how bespoke the whole place feels. But I definitely get
Mhm.
like putting Broom Tower over it.
Just like a little bit. I think maybe that's what I mean by one note is that it is kind of, yeah, it's just too tied to an existing area, which was kind of my one of my gripes with the Bloodborne DLC. Despite how like incredible it is to see, what is it, the like
Cathedral Ward.
cathedrals,
Yeah, the Hunter's
yeah, the
Nightmare.
cathedral ward in the other time, like in another time, essentially in the Hunter's Nightmare. I wish it would have been a whole new area, and I feel like maybe that's a little bit kind of what I'm feeling with Broom Tower, in that it is just feels like a little bit. It reminds me a little too much of the old Iron Keep, but
Totally. Yeah, and I think we
and
talked about that in the Bloodborne pod. I kind of feel like again, it was probably a little easier on the dev side to like rework Cathedral Ward for that DLC, And I get the effect of it. Like they kind of want you to understand it's like, oh, I'm in Cathedral Ward, but it looks different. And there's like hunters in like old antiquated hunters garb. So they're like giving you this idea
Mhm.
that you've like gone back in time in some kind of way. But yeah, like it kind of doesn't feel like the DLC, in my opinion, like gets real good until like you get to like Research Hall and Fishing Hamlet. So it's never really the first thing you want to see. I think when you get to a DLC is like, reused assets.
But yeah, and then to cap things off with the kind of the Ivory King, obviously the setting of Elimlois is incredible. It's the opposite of what we were just talking about. It feels like a wholly new area. It's this new icy kind of snow realm, the painted world type of vibes, that snowy energy. The bosses. I think Ava is pretty interesting. Fighting a giant invisible cat, or later, just one on one when you actually can see Ava is an interesting fight. And then the Burnt Ivory King is just such a spectacle that it's hard to hate on that fight just because it's so cinematic and you feel like you're in the fight with all the different amongst the knights and stuff. So
Yeah.
that's why that one, I feel like the Crown of the Ivory King is kind of the top of the food chain when it comes to the DLC for sure.
Same. In my memory, it was my favorite, and that was definitely reaffirmed during my playthrough. And I also like how with Ivory King, because he's kind of the one good one. Even the flavor text says that he was like merciful and yeah, he was a good king. And I kind of dig how not only does it kind of offsets the boss gauntlet at the end of the base game that it kind of left me wanting for more. But I also like that the Ivory King, he's like not really, it's not about like to link or not to link the flame. It's like, no, he's like trying to like save his people. He's trying to like stop the chaos from taking over his city to the point where he literally puts his own throne on top of this portal to the old chaos and then eventually goes down to face it with his knights. So it's kind of, again, if you think about it as like case studies, he wasn't playing like this politic game. He was a real one.
Real one indeed. Yeah, I just felt like it was the perfect way to kind of put the cherry on top of the whole DS2 experience too, just with such a hyper cinematic fight. Something that was maybe lacking in the Nashandra fight, which we were talking about earlier. I don't know. It kind of it put a bow on top of again an incredible Souls experience.